Order, order. Welcome to the Public Accounts Committee on Monday the 29th of June 2026. Millions of people across the UK experience permanent or temporary circumstances that prevent them from engaging with the three essential services for modern daily life: water, energy and broadband. The regulators of these three services, Ofwat, Ofgem and Ofcom, have statutory duties to protect or further the interest of consumers, including those in vulnerable financial circumstances. The NAO's report on this subject found that these regulators had made progress in clarifying expectations how far companies should support their consumers in vulnerable financial circumstances. However, as we all know, significant challenges still remain, with consumer debt to water and energy companies reaching a staggering £7.2 billion in March 25, and many consumers still find it difficult to contact their company in the event that something goes wrong. So today we're very fortunate to have with us a panel of real expert witnesses with a huge wealth of knowledge and experience working in these industries or with customers in these industries ahead of questioning government officials later this afternoon. We will be asking them what they think the barriers and challenges are to those vulnerable customers in financial circumstances engaging with water, energy, broadband services, amongst a number of other key issues. And we are very pleased to have, as I say, a very experienced panel this afternoon. I'm going to ask them to introduce each of themselves. Martin, would you like to start with you in the centre, and then either your left and right as well?
I'm Martin Lewis, founder of the MoneySavingExpert and founder of the Money and Mental Health Policy Institute.
Very pleased to have you. Thank you very much. Anne Pardoe, please.
I'm Anne Pardoe. I'm Head of Policy at Citizens Advice.
Thank you. Finally, by no means Miss Ali Bell.
I'm Ali Bell, and I am Director of Communications and Policy at the Consumer Council for Water, CCW.
Very good. Well, great to have you all with us. And I think to start us off, Catherine would like to start us off, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, all three of you, for being here. At the risk of asking a question that is so broad, where do you start? I think I'll go to you first, Martin, of where do you think the biggest challenges are for customers within the water, energy and broadband sectors at the moment, in your opinion?
I think there's still a huge amount of confusion, both for vulnerable people and non-vulnerable people across all of the different sectors. Some of that is caused by regulation, some of that is caused by external circumstances, some of that is caused by the way that companies operate. I have to say, I do think the situation is better than it was when I've done these things 15 years ago. I think there's been some improvement in behaviour and improvement in trust. An example of that would be 15 years ago, I would never have told people to contact their company when they're in trouble, because, in energy sector specifically, because I thought that they would behave as bad actors, and often did, and there was data on that. I think on that area it has changed, and I think that vulnerable customer activity has improved. But we have, I'll just do a brief bit on each. We have the energy market, where we have what was meant to be a backstop tariff for vulnerable customers that is now 60% of the population are on it, the energy price cap. That energy price cap is operating on a time lag. So the fact that the Middle East conflict started in March and we saw worldwide wholesale rates rise in March is only going to hit people's bills on the 1st of July. It will continue to hit people's bills in October and possibly next January. At the same time, fixes are getting cheaper. So you have a duality of market, one that's based on a 5-month time lag and one that's based on instantaneous wholesale prices. Vulnerable people can't and don't take advantage of the potential to fix right now. People who are on prepayment meters, there is no competition. So Ofgem rightly has made prepayment cheaper for those who are on price caps. It is now the cheapest way to pay. I think that was a good move. And so I get questions from the public, I'm on prepayment, is it cheaper, should I move? So I will give you my answer that I give to consumers. If you're going to stay on the price cap, you are better to stay on prepayment. If you can move off the price cap and you're able to engage in the market, there is a whole wealth of competition on direct debit that does not exist on prepayment. So those on direct debit who are willing to switch will pay materially, currently 17% more than those people who are on prepayment meters, even though prepayment meter is cheaper on the price cap. And the length of time it has taken me to explain that to you is an example of the complexity. If we look at mobile and broadband, which I hope you got the report we put out today, we had Ofcom regulation to bring in transparency 2 years ago on the back of above inflation price hikes, that in our examination of 47,000 tariffs shows 75% of people are paying more because of what Ofcom has done than they would have done otherwise. And 99% of people are paying more than if we'd done, and if you'll forgive the phrase, the bleeding obvious, and simply said you cannot raise prices mid-contract above inflation. The obvious solution. Why we don't do the obvious is not obvious, because it's pretty obvious that's what we should have done. If we go for water, I mean, water is a really interesting industry, one with which has competition, no. Privatisation, yes. And the worry is that we have the worst of both worlds when we come to that particular market. And we take the social tariff. I do not understand why the government did not universalise the social tariff. I mean, I take my job, I always look at, and I use this as an example, my job, mass communication. How do you communicate? How do I, on my television show, explain a social tariff? I have to say, if you're on a lower income, you may be eligible for a social tariff. But I'm afraid I can't tell you what a lower income is because it's different with every water company. In some it's defined by benefits, in some it's defined by income, in some it's defined by an income assessment. So basically my really rough rule of thumb, and I mean, why am I giving a rough rule of thumb, is if you earn under about £26,000, check out if you can get a social tariff. But that's not good enough because you know what happens? Someone goes and checks it out and they're on £23,000. They're told they're not eligible and they say to everyone, it's crap. I wasn't eligible, and he told me wrong because he said go and check, and all I can do is say this is the level at which you should check. So there's a nice, hopefully that gives you a broad spread of the different things going on in different industries where confusion tends to rule, certainly amongst vulnerable customers and many not so vulnerable. And a big question for you is, how far do you spread the help up the net? You know, do we only look at the very lowest people on means tested benefit, or what about those on low and middle incomes who are struggling with these systems too? I'll stop there.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's an incredibly comprehensive reply in terms of the breadth of the challenge here. And I think it's very interesting that you reference the challenges for vulnerable customers. But clearly, unless somebody makes a full-time job of this, even if you're not vulnerable, I think it's very difficult to navigate what are very complex systems, which you've rightly identified. It'd be helpful to understand to what extent, and you referenced at the beginning, the regulators have done some good things to improve the matter. So it'd be helpful to understand what more do you think they need to do to fix some of these challenges that you are outlining, and obviously there's many more besides.
So on energy, and I think probably worth saying, as you're all politicians, if I would say 2/3 of my mailbag, which I'm one of the few people who probably has one bigger than you, to be honest with you, 2/3 of my mailbag on energy complaints is very simply about the standing charge. The moral hazard that you have to pay £315 a year just to have the facility of having gas and electricity, that we have older people who don't use gas for 2/3 of the year and they're having to pay a daily charge for it, and that people who are lower users, if they reduce their usage, it doesn't make any difference because they're still paying the standard charge. That is by far and away the thing that drives people mad the most. And I always use the analogy, if I go to buy a book from a bookshop, they don't say, sorry, you have to be a member of a club and pay us each month in order to buy a book, because we have fixed costs. I don't have to pay my fixed costs are factored into the price of the book. Why do we have to have fixed costs factored into a daily charge and variable costs factored into a unit rate? The shift could be done, and I was very hopeful with Ofgem. We had long conversations that it was going to bring a dual price cap, a low standing charge higher unit rate and the normal standing charge and lower unit rate, which, and my view was that should be, people who are on the price cap should be automatically shifted to whichever one was beneficial for them based on their prior year's usage, with an opt-out basis if they chose not to. That was stopped, and then it was moved to this system of we're going to allow switchers tariffs and mandate switchers tariffs which have a lower standing charge. Now, my big problem with that is that doesn't help anybody who's vulnerable, because they're the people who don't switch that the price cap was set up to protect in the first place. So switchers tariff don't help. And then we're going to trial switchers tariffs, and they'll be coming in spring. Haven't seen any yet.
And just to focus on the sort of different types of customers that experience these challenges. I mean, I recently had a constituent who's 85. Excuse me. And out of excuse me, sorry.
Oh dear, water.
Out of nowhere, landed a bill, £575, and it was all to do with the being unable to make smart meter readings, and so they'd made an estimate. It was quite wild considering his energy use, and he had been writing to them only to discover that actually they don't have a postal address, and we're not receiving any of the letters. And that's just one example of clearly a vulnerable customer. That's a disabled 85-year-old. Have you got reflections on the different experiences of different customer groups with some of the particular challenges that you're outlining?
So with a different hat on Money and Mental Health Policy Institute charity, which I chair, we have a mental health accessible audit. And one of the things that we do for mental health, so I have less experience on the physical health side, is the thing to understand is for some people being text is a nightmare. For other people, text is the only way they can communicate. So when you're talking essential service providers, which all of the firms involved in this industries are, we have to start putting how you communicate rules on. I mean, many modern people, they only want digital, and I'm a digital person myself, I would want that. But there are many older, vulnerable people with disabilities of mental and physical health who need different contact mechanisms. We have a host of problems over billing. Billing is incredibly complex, especially in the energy world. We have the issue that you can't be back billed for more than 12 months, and I think Ofgem has been cracking down on that, but I still regularly get people who get in touch with me who've had 2 years of back billing. And if you don't know you can't be back billed for over a year, then you don't know to say, actually, I'm not paying for more than a year because it was your fault. I mean, there are technical rules. If you behaved wrongly, it doesn't matter. But effectively, if they haven't billed you for 2 years and it's their fault, they can't bill you for the longer than 12 months, but people still do get billed. And so surely one would think in this modern digital world, something is systemically going wrong in the companies in the way that we do this. The one final point, just because I'll throw it in when I've got my money and mental health hat on. Let's just take a picture of a physically or disabled person or someone with a mental health problem that is a severe problem, including potentially going into NHS mental health crisis care. So you have named water, so I've got my water company, I've got my energy company, I've got my broadband company. You've also got your mobile company, you've got your bank, you've got your insurer. And let's imagine I'm in a crisis mental health state, I'm having a fundamental anxiety situation, I'm potentially going to be hospitalised. And just to go back, we got to the state, we've had people who come out of NHS mental health crisis care who on the day they get back have bailiffs at their door. So this is not a small issue. And on that point, I have to call up my water company and tell them, I'm sorry, I'm going through a mental health crisis at the moment. And then I have to call my energy company. And then I have to call my broadband provider, my mobile provider, my bank, and my insurer. And these are actually detrimental to my mental health. There is no tell 'em once system. There is no tell 'em once database, and there are data privacy issues with all of this that would need to be handled. It could only be done on a voluntary basis. And actually, you're talking 3 different regulators. No criticism of them. They have their remits on this. But we're not just... These issues do not live in isolation of people's finances. They are a subset of everything that people deal with. And we have a fundamentally intransigent system that puts the burden on the vulnerable individual at moments of vulnerability to declare their vulnerability. And it shouldn't be like that in a digital world. I mean, this is the one time where you're actually capable. We need to have a centralised system where you can volunteer to tell them once. And that tell them once should go to all essential service and public service providers, as long as you're happy with that, with data privacy, and it's a voluntary system, not compulsory. And we need to start working that way. And in fact, the fact that you have it done on a tripartite level here is almost a problem in the start.
The risk of only scratching the surface. I'll hand back to you, Chair.
Could I just come back to you on that last point, Martin, if I may? Do you think we should have one unified system for the 3 regulators on total customer indebtedness, so that each of the 3 regulators would then be able to regulate a system on a total debt? Because it makes clear in the report somewhere that if you might be able to pay your energy bill of £500, but if you do, you're then likely to get into debt with your other utilities.
Yeah.
I haven't looked at that. I've looked at it more on the contact basis, so I'm just going to go slightly slow on that. And I would just reiterate, and forgive me, Chair, even if you unified those 3, and I'm going to plead the 5th on them, not that you do that in this country, but anyway, on debt, because I haven't looked at it. you're still only scratching the surface. I mean, the worst type of debt in this country is council tax debt. That is the one that you should not mess with. They have ridiculous enforcement powers, and it's far too quickly, and we've got the government to change that coming in next April. They're going to be changing those rules to slow it down a little bit. But you have the whole system of debt, and we have an underfunded debt counselling service in this country that are not joined in and interlinked to everything that is going on. I mean, we've got representative of someone who does brilliant work on that and has it over there with Citizens Advice on my right here. And so I think even if that were to work, and I'd need to do my thinking, it's not unified enough for me, for the vulnerable individual at a point of crisis. And the funny thing is, the only time we do this well is when someone's died. Mm-hmm. And maybe we should perhaps do it better while people are alive.
Mm. No, I accept that. I accept that I did say in my opening remarks, just water and energy, the two of them have reached the total debt of 7.2 billion. So we're getting into some pretty big figures here. Mm. Anyway, let's leave that for the moment. And although Tris was very kindly going to do the next question, Sarah, you're now here. So, Sarah Olney, please.
Coming at the right time. Thank you, Chair. Panel, from the cases you encounter, what, in your experience, are the most prominent barriers that consumers in vulnerable circumstances face when they're engaging with water, energy and broadband services? And if I can ask Ali Bell first.
Yes. So, CCW, Consumer Council for Water, we go round and do what we call complaint assessments and debt assessments. So basically, we go into the water company and we sit in the building with the customer services team for 2 days, and we do a real deep dive into a randomly selected bunch of complaints. So we listen to the phone recordings, we read the emails, we look at the case files, and we discuss with the customer service team what went well. There's lots of examples that we find of good practice and some examples of not so good practice. And so what we found from, wading through all of this in real detail is that customers don't always get offered the help that they need proactively. There's a certain amount of, utility companies, water companies, waiting to be asked by the customer for the help that they need. But we know that 39% of people who need financial help from their water company don't even know that that is a thing that they can ask for. So they're not asking for it because they didn't know it was there. We find that how this plays out is that they don't get the help that they need early enough in the whole process, and then obviously that means that then there's more problems. People who weren't in debt are getting into debt, people who were already in debt are getting into worse debt. We know obviously that people find it really, really difficult to talk about especially financial vulnerability with another person. There's loads of embarrassment, there's loads of shame, and people are really, really fearful that, if I bring this to the attention, if I proactively bring this to my water company's attention, these things are going to get worse for me. And honestly, not everyone knows that if you can't pay your water bill, you can't be cut off. So people are worried about the consequences, even though that's not a consequence. And we find that if people have mustered up the courage to tell their water company about their financial issues, even from what you were saying, even then within the water company, we then find that they then have to tell that story. Somebody will be passed on to another team and they have to start again and say that embarrassing, shameful story again. Or maybe they say, we'll call you back next week, and this is a different person, and then they have to tell that story all over again. So it is a massive issue, awareness, and also being able to tell that story.
Thank you. And I just wonder if I can ask you, what do you think the regulators can be doing to help to encourage the utilities to bring down those barriers for their vulnerable customers?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'd echo Ali in terms of what she said around some of those barriers. I think the other thing that we're increasingly seeing is the use of AI within chatbots for when people are trying to contact through the website and getting kind of stuck in this cycle. So they're trying to ask for help, and maybe online is the way they feel most comfortable doing that. But I'm sure we've all done it when we're sort of trying to contact customer service on a website, and you just end up, you don't give quite the right answer, and you just end up in an endless cycle. And also we see this issue with our advisors as well. So we did some research recently on challenges that our debt advisors in particular face in representing our clients, and even our advisors can find it really difficult to get in contact with creditors, including energy companies, water companies and telecoms companies as well, with like them being really slow to act, not being able to access through different channels. I think it's really on regulators to make sure that they're like really monitoring this very carefully and setting clear
the use of AI or more broadly
the way
that they are
because it's really essential that people are able to contact their essential services providers when they're having difficulty, whether that's kind of directly or through an advice provider like Citizens Advice. So we really need to make sure that the regulators are really on top of this and kind of putting requirements in place where the kind of data is showing that that's not being effective.
Thank you, Sarah.
Fine, yeah, thank you.
Could we then please perhaps go to Rachel?
Yes, of course. So going back to what Ofwat and Ofgem aren't doing to help out vulnerable customers, what more do you think they could do in terms of awareness to make people aware of the financial support and social tariffs among potentially eligible consumers? Because as a Member of Parliament, I have people coming to my surgeries, and even I mean, that sounds very grandiose, doesn't it? Even I am not aware of where there is support from whom and at what levels.
May I take that one?
Yeah, that is for you, sorry.
Okay.
Lewis.
Funny, I was talking to Dom on one of my team who's behind me before, and we were talking about, he went onto a water company site as he was doing some research on the back of this. Do you know what your equivalised income is? Because I don't know what my equivalised income is, but that's what you're asked. If you have an equivalised income, was that the phrase, Dom? Yeah. Equivalised income. I suspect none of us in the room know what our equivalised income is.
What does it mean?
I still don't know. That's the phrase that was one of the water companies for whether you're entitled to a social tariff or not. If your equivalised income is below X amount. Now I know. Exactly. So, and the point I'm making is, well, if none of us in this room know what that means, and I don't know what that means, then I think it's probably not a good way to communicate it to vulnerable people.
Is that because they don't want to establish what it means, because they don't want to offer up the potential help?
I tend to think it's because they're crap at communicating.
I tend to agree.
I tend to think this isn't conspiracy, it's just crap. But I also think...
Again, Mr. Lewis.
Pardon?
Come again, we like straight talkers here.
But I think that what the regulator could do is crack down on crapness, if you like, if I'm allowed to keep saying the word. And I don't see why. I mean, I've had this in so many different sectors. We've had it recently with councils that they weren't explaining when you're entitled to the SMI discount correctly, and different websites were doing it. And it was a third of councils all had it wrong on their websites. Now, there aren't as many water companies. So in terms of you could start by a communications audit of how these water companies are communicating the social tariffs. Far better if they all had the same social tariff. We could have centralised, really good communication. Then I could go on the telly, and lots of other people could, and tell the whole country exactly how it works without having to simply say check, and then you check and it's equivalised income. Broadband. So according to Policy and Practice, 3.8 million households are missing out on water social tariffs. It's just outrageous. Broadband, 7.5 million households, though some cases broadband social tariffs aren't as good as the competitive tariffs out there if you're prepared to switch and switch again. What I find interesting on this, and I'm not doing this as a rent-seeking thing, I made sure that we have social tariffs in MoneySavingExpert's broadband comparison. And we ask you if you're on certain benefits, and then we include it if you are, and we don't include it if you're not likely to be eligible. I believe we're the only comparison that does have social tariffs in, because of course social tariffs don't pay. They don't pay lead fees, so that you don't generate any money if somebody switches through that particular mechanism. I think that doesn't seem to be the way to communicate it for me. I would think it should be in every different comparison that goes on there. So I would be putting that one in there. And then on energy, well, I mean, the biggest problem in energy is we don't have a social tariff. We went for a backstop tariff. I call it the pants cap, not the price cap. We went for a backstop tariff that was meant to be so that the people who never switch will not be quite as hideously ripped off as they would be if under a no price cap situation. But now we've moved into a quasi-regulated tariff for 60% of the population. And actually what we should be doing, in energy is we should be defining who are the legitimate victims of competition and who are the illegitimate victims of competition. If you forgive me, and I mean it in a complimentary way, if all of you stay on the price cap and you pay too much because of it, that's your own fault, because you're educated digital natives who are capable of doing that piece of work for yourself, and it is out there. This is if we want a competitive market. I'm agnostic. You could also regulate all prices. It's not a market championing bit. But alternatively, then we have your struggling 90-year-old with dementia who pays more to boil a kettle than I do, because that's how it works, because I, of course, am on a good tariff, as you would expect, and therefore is an illegitimate victim of competition. So even before we get into this, we have never defined who are legitimate and illegitimate victims. And if you're going to work on the method of you have a market-based solution, as I say, I'm agnostic, I'm not championing it, I'm just saying I work within the system that exists, then you have to have price differentials if you want competition, because price differentials are what incentivises people to move from tariff to tariff. And, grab a good tariff at the moment you can when a one-year fix is cheap. So who can do that? Who can't do that? Who should we protect? Who shouldn't we protect? And what we have is a halfway house between a market system and price regulation, and we have the worst of both worlds. So there are some really big systemic problems going on in all these sectors.
Could I ask Anne to answer the question, because I know you come from a slightly more sort of grassroots perspective in terms of the Citizens Advice Bureau?
Yeah, see, we've done quite a lot of work around social tariffs, and the annual report and Martin's absolutely right. Awareness of these tariffs is really low, and take up as well. I think a really big problem is like a lack of standardisation, as Martin said. It makes it really difficult for people to work out what they're entitled to and also to claim it as well. I think in water there was a really critical opportunity to sort of deal with the standardisation. A lot of organisations were calling for a single social tariff, and the Cunliffe Independent Water Commission also recommended this. The government decided not to move ahead with that at this stage. I think that was a really big missed opportunity. And then in broadband, frankly, there's just, it's a voluntary scheme. There's absolutely no incentive for telecoms companies, broadband companies to A, get these right, and B, promote them. They've done very little in terms of promoting these tariffs amongst their customers. There's also a slight issue with broadband social tariffs in that people worry about the speeds and whether those products will be appropriate to meet their needs. So what we're suggesting now that is in broadband, instead of a specific tariff, you could have a voucher for low-income consumers for them to use to offset the cost of a package which actually works for them. I think at the moment it's really difficult for people. I mean, in energy's take-up of the warmer home discount is around 70%. In broadband, it's less than 9%, and we've had them for a number of years now. Citizens Advice was sort of been calling for them to be made mandatory for a long time, but I think at this point the voucher is probably the solution that we would go with for broadband.
Can I just echo on that? So absolutely, with broadband, the problem is the speed. A social tariff might be £20 a month for 75 meg, but if you're a churner and you're willing to switch, you can get £13 a month for 115 meg, lasting a year, and then you'll have to change tariff again. And again, we have criteria totally different with each firm. Usually it's linked to universal credit, but some only give job seekers free broadband for 6 months. So there's no consistency. Therefore, you don't have any competition between firms, and you might have to switch firm to do it. The voluntary scheme, as always would happen with self-regulation, leads to a huge variety and a lack of communication about it. And actually, I haven't heard the voucher idea before. I think it's a very clever one.
Happy to send it to you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. Enlightening.
Just on the back of Rachel's question, and I don't necessarily need all three of you to answer, but is there a case that either or any of the utilities could put more information on the bills, whether they be paper or electronic? Things like the social tariff availability, the SRA, just so that people are aware that if they're in trouble, these are the things they need to be looking out for.
I don't think it would work.
Okay.
Because people don't read their bills.
Right.
So with a different element on, if we go back to where I started about the 75% of people are paying more because of the transparency situation, there is a get out of jail free card for companies in that, which is if you are going to do a price hike above a price hike, or you're going to do non-notified price hikes, as Sky opts out and it doesn't work within the system with anyone else and has been allowed to basically totally bypass the transparency system, you can get people to leave with 30 days notification, 30 days after notification. Now, interestingly, it's 30 days after notification. So it's not 30 days after your bill goes up. So you've got this one quick window to leave. People don't leave on bulk because they don't read their letters from their providers. And so you would need, if you wanted it to be done properly, interventionist schemes, not on your bill. It needs to be a direct manifest communication of a similar type to the way they do their marketing when they're trying to sell, when they actually want to communicate with you. And it needs to be properly thought through and put on the same basis. Bills are big, complicated things that people don't understand anyway. And the slight danger, and forgive me, I hope I'm not, I get why, the slight danger is, what happens is, and I've seen this in so many sectors, firms add it to the bottom of the bill and say, well, we put it on the bottom of the bill, that's what you wanted, and nobody's seeing it, but now you've just allowed them to tick the box that they've done it, but it doesn't work. So intervention it needs to be done on a much more proactive basis, basically the same way that they sell. This needs to be sold to customers in the same way they're trying to sell them other tariffs. And it needs to be done with a legitimiser from the regulator on the back, with proper communication. You are entitled to this. This is an Ofcom, Ofgem, Ofwat scheme, right, that you can go and look it up separately on the site that means you're entitled to a tariff that other people... It's got to be a whole different way of communicating to get it across.
Very helpful. Thank you, Martin. Chris wanted to come back on a previous question, I think.
Yeah, so very quickly, you've already highlighted the fact that the regulatory environment is woeful. If 4 in 10 are not accessing social tariffs now in water companies and 3 in 10 in broadband, surely it's time to potentially look at a different approach where the regulators do actually have some teeth. Is there some examples in Europe or other nations where they've got this right, where there's just better access for vulnerable customers? And what are they doing that we could be learning?
I'm hugely parochial and only do the UK, so I can't answer your question, I'm afraid. I don't know if you're better than me.
Yes, Ali.
Well, I'm also extremely parochial and I only do England and Wales. However, we see that more and more people are aware of the social tariffs in water in the last kind of 2-3 years, which is partly because obviously the bills are stinging more, and then there's a cost of living crisis, and also someone's doing a lot of work to raise awareness of this thing. We found in our Water Matters this year that 56% of people are aware that there is social tariffs out there to help them. We're not convinced that it is the economic regulators' job to kind of do marketing of social tariffs. We don't necessarily think that that's where your customers would think to look for that. Obviously, we agree totally that with everybody that we need a single social tariff. But Ofwat already does have, since 2024, a customer-focused licence condition which says water companies should provide support for customers who are struggling to pay and customers in debt. Now, we understand that Ofwat is going to use this customer-focused licence condition to look at the Tunbridge Wells incident at Christmas when tens of thousands of people had no water. What we would like to see is Ofwat being much more proactive and much more curious in using this to make the water companies do this in much more standard business as usual. This should be the default of what we're providing. So we think the licence condition is really good. It's written really well. It is pretty comprehensive. But I think the way it gets used is just when there's been an incident, we look retrospectively at what happened, and actually we think the regulator could use it as a thing to enforce this is the good practice that we want to see from you all the time. So there is something here, it's just not been used and not been used as much as it should, and not been used in the way that it perhaps could be to improve things for vulnerable customers.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tris. Sarah Green, please.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to ask Anne a question, if I may, and it's specifically around rising consumer debt in the energy sector. I'm sure your advisors are inundated with helping, do you call them clients? What do you call them?
Clients, people, depends on the context.
Yeah,
people.
the general public. What more do you think Ofgem itself could or should be doing to help address that rising consumer debt?
So it's a bit of a tricky one, in that energy debt absolutely is a huge problem, rising far more quickly than it has in the past, and it's reached completely unmanageable levels as well. And we've seen a 70% increase in the number of households in energy debt since 2021.
How would you define energy debt? Sorry, is that just anybody?
So that's people who are in arrears on their energy bill. So they've fallen behind on it. But the problem that we've got now is that there's this massive backstock of debt which was built up during the energy crisis when prices rose really steeply. We've started to see those come down a little bit now, but we've got this sort of legacy of debt that people, or the people that we help, are really going to struggle to ever pay down, frankly. And then you've also got, even at these slightly lower levels, people are still not able to afford those debts, so they're still creeping up. So you've kind of got this dual problem. Ofgem's been sort of working on this energy debt write-off scheme, which we think is a really good idea, because although it would kind of be funded primarily through people's energy bills, frankly, that money is never going to be paid back because households simply can't afford to pay it. So you're sending good money after bad, chasing that debt, and what people need is a clean break. Unfortunately, that scheme's been delayed. It's stuck between sort of Ofgem and the government in terms of sign-off. We think that if that could be signed off as soon as possible, that would be a great step forward. But then we also need to look at, like, going forward, how can we kind of help people to get back on top of those bills and be able to afford their ongoing consumption, which is where we get into things like reforming the warm home discount, and also looking at what more targeted support might be needed as the effects of the crisis in Iran comes through on the price cap over the next 6 months or so. What I'd say is it's not something just the regulator can fix. It is very much a societal problem. So Ofgem for sure has a part to play in this, but really kind of it's a problem that the government equally needs to grapple with, because Ofgem can't fix the sort of societal issue of people not being able to afford their essentials.
You have a perspective you wanted to share?
Yeah, I agree with pretty much everything that was said there. I think this is one area Ofgem have been working very hard on and have some pretty decent solutions. And the whole point, the people who can't pay, trying to push them to pay and spending resources to push them to pay, actually they need to pay their bills now. It is more important than the legacy debt from the energy crisis that we got there, which is how the scheme works. There are small things that can be done. Moving house is a big reason that many people have energy debt, because they don't pay their final bills and it keeps languishing, and some of those people can pay the bills, and it seems to me that we don't have the technological solutions in place that just make that work, so that isn't going on to everybody else's bills when you move house and you choose not to pay. I do think the standing charge is an issue here, because again, when you're a low user, you can't cut your bill because of the standing charge. And I still think, although it has got better, we have problems with unfair direct debits. I get huge numbers of complaints from people who have their direct debit going up 70% when nothing has changed and they're in credit. And it amazes me that companies' systems are simply not good enough. And then I tell them to quote, I think it's section 17 of your gas and electricity licence conditions, that you need to have a fair direct debit, and they have to justify it to you, and then they come back going, oh, they've lowered it. And there are all those people out there they haven't lowered it for, who therefore have an interstitial cash flow crisis, even though they'll get the money back in the end, which can risk hurting the rest of their finances and knock them into water debt and knock them into other debt, because their direct debit has been set too high and they're 80 years old and they don't know that the company's just got its estimate wrong or its computer's got a glitch on the back of it. So I still think there are things that we could do on top of everything else out there. Make the industry work as it should would be the phrasing.
Really helpful. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Sarah. We now move on to Clive, please.
Right, thanks, Chair. We've explored quite a lot of the problems and maybe some potential solutions, but a nice simple question to finish with then, each of you. What is one thing the regulators could do to actually improve the outcomes, particularly for consumers who've got financially vulnerable circumstances?
Yeah, I'm happy to go first. Thank you very much. I think a really quick win would be a multi-sector priority services register, as Martin was talking about earlier, kind of this idea that you have to kind of contact every single utility provider that you have when you've got additional need and you need help. If there's a sort of version of a tell it once, I think that would be, tell us once, that would be really incredibly helpful. And then also, I think, sorry, I'm going to sneakily ask for two. Another one would be, as we've kind of like talked about, and Martin's talked about really eloquently, like these markets are just so complex. You can't underestimate the value of independent advice. Citizens' advice, I would say that, but our energy advice delivers £25 million worth of benefits to energy consumers each year. That's because we're the statutory advice provider. This provision doesn't currently exist within the telecom sector, and people are really missing out in an area where it's incredibly complex. People have problems and they need help. So we would also call for statutory advice and advocacy within the telecom sector as well.
Would that mean payment to you from the companies?
It wouldn't necessarily be citizens' advice. I mean, I think that we could do a good job of it for sure. But it's levy on the industry of about 2p per household per year. As I said, in energy, we deliver benefits of 25 million just through our advice, and we're a really strong voice for consumers in the room when decisions are made as well. So we more than pay for ourselves. I think it's less about which organisation it would be, and more about this is a really key gap within an essential market where you have it in water, it's fulfilled by CCW. We fulfil that role in energy and post. You've got transport focus. So across a wide range of essential markets, you've got these provisions, but in the telecoms market, it's like completely absent at the moment, which is a really big gap.
Well, I've mentioned cutting the standing charge, and I've mentioned banning mid-contract price hikes above inflation, which I think is just such an easy win, and a universal social tariff, so I won't mention any of those again. Yes, sorry. I'm going to give a slightly different example, so it's not something I've said before, which I think is endemic. I talk, most consumers I deal with aren't vulnerable. And I talk when you come to the end of your contract on your broadband or mobile bill or digital television or roadside recovery or whatever it is. If you want to stay where you are, haggle. Over 80% of people who haggle on breakdown cover succeed. Not quite as high, 60 to 70% of people on broadband and mobile deals at the end of their contract. When you've got a mental health condition, you're vulnerable, you're not haggling. So you're just lost. And there's an unequal market there's an information inequality going on out there. And ultimately, the bizarre thing when I listen to my wonderful peers who are sitting alongside me, they're dealing with vulnerable people who are struggling to access information, whereas people like me, we get all the best deals.
How do you enforce that?
Well, what you have to do is you have to say, it's amazing. So what we've done is we put these social tariffs, not in energy, we put these social tariffs in to try and break that inequality, but then we still rely on people to have to claim them. And the people who can claim them are the people who aren't entitled to them, because that's the breakdown. So you have to work it an entirely different way. They need to be given automatically. We need databases that show people to go on. We're saying to the vulnerable people, it's the same as we had with the bloody winter fuel payment. Pension credit is the most underclaimed benefit in the country. Why on earth was it linked to the most underclaimed benefit? 700,000 of the poorest pensioners in the country don't get pension credit, and we link this crucial payment to them. We need to stop relying on the vulnerable individuals to act like they're, highly fluent middle-class churners like me.
We get the intention. So you've got a social tariff.
Yeah.
How does the company know who it should be applied to?
Well, if you had the centralised database of vulnerability that came in the first place, and they were tasked for doing the work and outreach in one centralised area to cut government and regulatory business down, they could be going and they could be putting people on these tariffs. I don't believe anybody is going to object to being put on a social tariff that caps your bill without asking for it.
I just want to know how the information is given if the customer doesn't voluntarily say.
We could start by joining government up, because government has all that information available to it right now. It has people's incomes, it has everything that's going on. There are hundreds of different ways. If you forgive me, allow me to go and talk to my team, and we'll come up with a mechanism that can suggest it better rather than policy on the fly.
Yeah, okay, that would be really helpful.
Yeah.
Yes, we have seen, when we do our debt assessments, we have seen some examples of water companies proactively putting people on payment schemes and tariffs that are better for them without waiting to be asked. So we think that is happening and it seems to be really working. And we've also seen some water companies looking at credit reference agency data so that before somebody goes into debt, they can contact them and help them. So there is some really good examples of best practice out there, but I agree it doesn't happen as standard and it doesn't happen as one thing. And and if we want our wish list from CCW, obviously we also have been calling for a single social tariff since 2021, so that's not my ask, but Martin was saying how the practicalities of kind of how it doesn't work. We totally agree with all of that, and we also think that it kind of leaves social policy being set by, the board of the water company, and we don't think that's necessarily right, and we definitely don't think it's working. So we wouldn't say it was for the regulator to do that either. We want every water company to have a dedicated, specially trained expert kind of extra care team or whatever you want to call them. We don't think that's necessarily for the regulator. We think that would mean that customers would be treated according to their needs, the people in the most need would get the most help and the most kind of specialised, dedicated expert help from people that understood how all your vulnerabilities kind of intersect. And we actually think that that would be better for water companies as well as for customers, because we think if you could solve that kind of first go, that would probably cut down on your repeat contact. So we think that probably should be done by water companies. But the thing we would ask for the regulator is for them to use the customer focused licence condition much more proactively and with much more curiosity, and to make things happen as your baseline, as your standard. This is the default. All the companies are doing this for customers who are vulnerable, and not just wait till there's been a massive incident that's, caused loads of attention and then use it to look at that.
I think we'll manage to create one suggestion to say. That's very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, Clive. If nobody else has got any questions, I've got one or two questions just to finish up on. Should PSRs be seen as a gateway to reaching consumers with vulnerabilities?
Yeah, absolutely. Priority service registers are a really useful way of essential services providers to know who's likely to need more help in particular circumstances. And it can be a useful way to identify who needs more support more broadly. But what we know is awareness of these schemes is currently really low. And you have to go through the rigmarole of kind of signing up to each one. So I'd like to see kind of cooperation across the regulators to see if there's a way that kind of that data can be shared in a safe way and with people's consent. And our research also showed broad support amongst the population for a single priority service register as well. It just feels like quite a simple way to kind of identify, which people are more likely to need support. And also, just kind of might lead to more ways to kind of identify those people who might be eligible for sociable tariffs, but agree with Martin that there's kind of government has all of the data that you need. There's examples of data sharing in energy market, for example, so just much more consistency and just making it easier for people to get the support that they need.
Yes, Sally.
Yeah, on PSRs in water, what we see a lot is a lot of kind of confusion, like you're saying, people kind of assuming that it is a gateway, and we think this is because a lack of kind of good, clear information. 2 in 5 people on PSRs have been contacted by their water company since they joined it, only 2 in 5. 59% of PSR customers, like you were saying, think that it means that if there's an outage and there's no water, they will get their water back first, and that isn't automatically true. So people are thinking, well, why didn't I get my water? That's not what being on the PSR means. Just over 1 in 5 think that it also means that they will get, as you were saying, kind of automatically somehow put on a beneficial tariff or a scheme that helps them, and obviously that isn't necessarily the same thing. And in the Tunbridge Wells incident at Christmas, we went back and did some research after that incident, and we found that half the people who were on the PSR didn't receive the help that they expected during that whole incident. And I think what we feel like is happening is that companies are building a list and they're not really building those relationships. It's like we often hear things like the company will say, well, we gave out bottled water. We went around in a van and we delivered bottled water to everybody who was on the PSR. And we would say, well, why did you do that? Because if you're like 25 and you're 6'2" man who's deaf, you might well be on the PSR so that you can be communicated with in the way that is useful to you. You don't necessarily need bottles of water brought round to your house, ahead of somebody else. And then what we also found in that incident was that people who had huge mobility issues had loads of massive bottles of water dumped at the end of their front path, which they couldn't bring into the house, they couldn't take it into the kitchen, they couldn't get it up on the side. So I think a PSR needs to be more than a list. It needs to be something that really understands, yes, this person is on this list, what do they actually need and what do they want? Because I think there's a real assumption that, that's what you want and that's what you need. So they need to be a real living thing that really understands people's needs, instead of being, yes, I've got to listen, ticked it off and I've done the thing.
I think the one thing I would say about that is, it echoes what you said earlier. The problem is, a board of a company's job is to make money for their shareholders in most cases. And what we have to do is they get too much discretion in how they internally operate what should be social policy on behalf of the nation. And actually that should be something that's mandated either by government or through regulators, and there should be specific ways and operating procedures to go there. But we don't. We effectively subcontract this out to the private sector. And the private sector, these companies are not there to say, and their job is, they're sitting at the board tables and someone is regretfully having to tell them that we need to meet these requirements, and they're ducking. But they're really, we all know, and I work as part of a PLC, we know that what the people at the top are doing is they're going, are we meeting our targets at the moment? And those targets are about financial targets, and that's the problem, ultimately. And so therefore what you need is, that there are times you need more proactive and prescriptive regulation about how it should operate, and there are times you need policy-based regulation. When it comes to dealing with vulnerable customers where there's no competitive issues, and there aren't competitive issues in this, then actually you need to have more prescription about what should and shouldn't be done, and it's a bit flaccid at the moment.
So I have a final question, and I love, Martin, your conversation with Clive about blue skies thinking as to how you can have a central source of vulnerable customers' information, so that each of the three utility companies don't have to invent the wheel every time. That central register of that information can only work, given your fantastic examples at the beginning of the different benefits and definitions of vulnerability. So isn't the first stage to agree what the definitions are, what benefits enable you to qualify for these things and what don't? Once you've got that, you can have the central register, and then you can start to come up with perhaps even a prompt to customers as to whether they are eligible for a PSR or a social tariff or not, rather than having to claim from the individual utility and all the problems that we've discussed today.
I think you could work it either way round. If you had a central register, even if it was fitting into differential policies, if the central register has the right data, then it can be, in an AI world, it isn't that difficult to match people to their policies that's going on. The unified, it's a long time. I mean, we need to be realistic to have a unified essential services register, and I would go way beyond just the three sectors you're talking. I think it needs to be far wider. It is a massive national project, and I'll be honest, I actually looked at whether I could do something as a charity, and then once I started to look into it, I went, this has to come from government. It's too big, and the data security issues are too big for private individuals to do it. We have, Money and Mental Health Policy Institute has done a paper on it and how you would do it, and I can get that submitted to you if that would be helpful.
Would. Thank you very much indeed. So I'll give the last word to Rupert Lowe.
Well, yes, thank you very much. I found it very interesting what you're saying. I just got a question really, because this isn't my area of expertise, but I'm inclined to agree with you that we've got the worst of all worlds here. We've got private monopolies reporting to, as you say, boards of shareholders. So do you know, before, and this doesn't apply obviously to broadband, but before we got water and energy, how did the water corporations and the sort of, if you like, power utilities, how did they used to deal with it when they were in public ownership? Did they pass the best rates on to everybody, or did they have differential charging? Because I suspect a lot of this may have developed over time, and I've been quite interested to look at the fact, it appears to me that Ofwat, CCW appear to be providing the role of ombudsman, as far as I can see from figure 2 here. So I was quite, do any of you know how it was dealt with? Because if we had a situation where rather than all this business of talking about whether they've disclosed it, whether they've made it easier to obtain, and I agree with you, a lot of the people we're trying to help aren't going to have the mental capacity or indeed the intellect to get the best rates. As you say, you're a chopper and a changer and a bobber and a weaver, and you can, but they may not be able to. So do you know, how did they deal with it when they were in public ownership?
Being too young, I'm afraid. I'm so sorry.
Well, you probably are, yes.
Yeah,
yes. So nobody knows. Does anyone else know?
Before my time.
How did they deal with it? Did they have a social responsibility to?
I'm not sure. I think it would have been on rateable value to start with. I think these tariffs are newer and that metering and things have come in after, and it would have just been on rateable value of your property. That's my assumption.
I think it's the big, certainly on energy, the proportion of your income that energy takes has grown substantially over the years, and especially in the previous few years. So I think the amount of attention that it faces, even when I started, it was back in 2000, once it was privatised, energy bills were just, they were one of those pieces of housekeeping that I had to encourage people to do, because you're going to be saving 70, 80 quid, and, you know, whereas now it's, I mean, unfortunately, the savings aren't huge now because of the market conditions. They're just such a huge proportion of your bid. You know, the typical use figure, which is it's a bit of a myth, the typical use figure, but is £1,800 or dropping on £1,600 a new figure. It's now a huge proportion if you contrast that to the state pension of what people have. So I think, I don't know the answer to your question, I best be honest about that, but I think it's just become all more important.
I mean, I'm of adequate intelligence and I run lots of businesses, and we find it very difficult, even in a business environment, to be able to keep up with particularly the energy prices. And I think, you know, you've now got this sort of underworld of people who leapt up, who sort of disintermediate between the energy companies and the end user. And there's almost been a new market created for people like that. It's quite interesting. It's quite interesting. It's an interesting debate, Jeff.
Yeah, okay. Anna has a quick question.
Yes, if I may, and particularly to Martin in the area of mobile and broadband. I just wondered if you had a view, it comes from personal experience of my 85-year-old parents, but I wouldn't call them vulnerable, of automatic renewals, huge exit fee for moving house, even though the provider couldn't provide the new house, a bill of £1,600 just dropped out of nowhere, and also staying on and being charged by a mobile provider for paying for a handset which was long past spending and not shifting onto a sort of pay-as-you-go fee. Huge number of things that I think make ripping people off. What would you say, Martin, to that?
Well, I literally have a soapbox on my show, and I have got on my soapbox on all those issues. The fact that, and it tends to be resellers rather than main networks, that you can sign somebody up to a £35 a month tariff, of which effectively £30 is paying for the handset that you got. After 2 years, you've paid off the handset, but they don't drop it. You still pay £35. So effectively, it's a confusion tariff. It's debased, is outrageous. The whole way that if you move broadband, that you don't have a right to cancel your contract, and it's pretty easy. You know, you have a conveyancing solicitor when you move house, and those conveyancing solicitors are able to sign documents that says you're entitled to your lifetime ISA or your Help to Buy ISA money. And within that, if you really, broadband companies are so scared that someone might try and jemmy the system, we could just add it something that you get a small note from your conveyancing solicitor so you could get out of contract. All of those are fundamentally unfair. But I go back to the fact that we now have a system where the regulator has regulated that companies can increase prices whenever they want mid-contract, as long as they tell you about it in advance. And it's a bit like saying, if I came up to you in the street, it's fine if I punch you in the face as long as I told you about it beforehand. Yeah. And I don't think that's the right way. Now, I'll just take my 1 second on that. I'm getting some flack because I'm saying they should be allowed to increase rates by inflation mid-contract. Of course I don't want that. Of course I think a contract should be a contract on the price. But I'm hearing arguments about investment, and I'm also saying, well, that could slightly jemmy the marketplace because they would have to provision too high in the first place in case costs went up. So the rule in my eyes is there should be no real increase during contracts. So you set it at CPI inflation. We all know what that means, and that would work. Yeah, I mean, companies get away with too much in a way that's anti-consumer, and those are things I would hope the regulator would look at. But they've been around a long time and not been looked at yet.
Joint campaign, Anna.
Thank you.
I just do 2 seconds
very
on
briefly,
the telecom. Totally agree with all of that. I mean, telecoms pricing, what our research shows is that the best deals are hidden. So they're never advertised. You have to call up and haggle and say that you're going to leave, and then you get them. And then when you take a contract, the ones which are there, our research shows that no one understands. The ones on the website, they're too complicated. And then you take a deal and then the price goes up mid-contract anyway. So telecoms pricing is a
tiny disagreement, but not a proper one. They're not hidden, and this isn't a plug. They're on Money Saving Expert. And the reason they're on Money Saving Expert is because our users are switchers. So those people where there's an elasticity of demand get cheaper prices, and they give all the comparison sites have the cheapest deals, and the cheapest deals are not done by cheaper tariffs, they're done by 150 quid Amazon voucher. Because if you do cheaper tariffs, you have to, effectively, the bigger companies have to offer those to existing customers on their own websites. So you have the list price on your website, and then you come to a site like mine, and I would say we are the cheapest, but there we go. You come to a site like mine, and we have better deals, but they're done via marketing incentives on top, rather than reducing tariff prices, so you'd have to offer to existing customers. Yeah. That's the way the marketplace works. So it is about those in the know get a lot cheaper. And that's okay, again, if we go to legitimate and illegitimate victims. But the problem is when we're within this purview of vulnerable customers, in my view, are illegitimate victims. And that's the problem.
Fantastic. Can I thank all three of you very much? This has been a tremendously informative session. Really, really grateful to all three of you for spending time with us today. That quote from Martin, companies get away with too much, and I'm going to ask the regulators in a minute about that. Thank you all very much. An uncorrected version of our transcript will be available in the next few days. We will, I think, produce a report on this with recommendations. We hope you'll look at those. If you disagree with them, come back to us. And we hope the government will take them on board. So, again, many thanks for coming today. Order, order. Welcome back to the Public Accounts Committee on Monday the 29th of June 2026. We now move into our second panel. And we've just heard from an excellent cast of witnesses about the challenges many people face in accessing their water, energy and broadband services. The Priority Services Register, PRS, was created to help those who may need extra support when engaging with these services. However, a survey reported by Citizens Advice in 2026 found that public awareness of the PRS system still remains low. Take-up has increased. At 24.5 it stood at 34% in energy, but considerably lower for 13% in water, but remains below estimates that half of households might be eligible. So today, we will be scrutinising what the regulators are trying to achieve in relation to consumer experience and companies' communication with customers, as well as what they're doing to address high levels of consumer debt. We'll also be examining how regulators promote consistency of support to customers with additional communication, safety, access needs, and enable companies to prioritise support in the event of supply interruption, and pressing regulators to align their own performance measurements with the experience of their consumers. So, without any further ado, I'm going to ask everybody to introduce themselves. So I'm going to start, please, with a long-time guest of this committee, Dame Melanie Dawes.
Thank you, Sir Geoffrey. I'm Melanie Dawes and I'm the Chief Executive of Ofcom.
And before that you were?
Permanent Secretary at the Ministry for Housing, Communities and Local Government, where, as you say, I appeared many times before this committee.
Now, Tim, I understand you were once a clerk, you were also worked at the NAO, and now you're appearing before us. So congratulations, you've completed the PAC triumvirate. Would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Yes. Thank you, Chair. I'm Tim Jarvis. I'm the Chief Executive of Ofgem.
Thank you. And finally, by no means least, Chris.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Chris Walters, and I'm the Chief Executive of Ofwat.
Very much indeed. Right, without any further ado, I think Matt is going to start us off with the first question, please.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon. We're going to start with a relatively broad question, which is, what does a positive consumer experience for those in financially vulnerable circumstances look like in your sectors? Thank you. If we start with Tim and perhaps go along.
Yes, thank you. So I think for people in financially constrained circumstances in the energy sector, and some of this will apply to all consumers and some of this will be specific to them, but I think what we want to see is people build accurately and on time. And then I think the important thing is that when there is evidence that people are starting to struggle, for example, if they are missing direct debits or they're coming off direct debits, that the supplier is intervening early and quickly and in a sympathetic and empathetic way with that customer, and that they are made aware of support that is available to them to help them if they are struggling with their household finances, and that if they have got into debt, what is made available to them is a reasonable way of trying to get that debt down and repay that debt according to an amount that they can afford. And we have rules in place that seek to ensure that is the service that customers get and that they get that support.
Thank you. Melanie.
Yeah. Well, look, I think we would want to see that financially vulnerable customers have as close a possible experience as they can to everybody else, assuming that that's a positive one. Overall customer satisfaction on broadband is 84%, and it's around 79-80% for vulnerable customers, so it's a bit lower, but still quite high. It's a different market, I think, from water and energy. It's a very competitive market for broadband and mobile, so what we would want to see above all else is that there's a range of good deals out there for people depending on their circumstances that are affordable, that they can navigate the market as easily as possible, that they can switch when they think that's the right way to get a better deal, but particularly for those who are vulnerable for whatever reason, that when something goes wrong, they're treated fairly, kindly. We have requirements in our code about how that should look. Customer contact needs to work. There need to be many options for how you can do it, email, phone, post, whatever. And then finally, I would add, I think there are special cases on the broadband side right now, including the switchover from the public switched telephone network, which is particularly important for elderly customers or anyone else on a care alarm. And so we've got, with the government actually, a very close eye on all of that a requirement for any of the telecoms companies who have got something wrong to tell us immediately, and some very clear and quite specific rules about how that transition, which must happen, needs to be managed.
Thank you. There are three facets to what we're trying to do in terms of achieving good outcomes for customers and customer experiences. They're driven by our duties to customers to protect their interests with good quality, efficient services at a fair price, wherever appropriate, by promoting effective competition, ensuring that water companies properly carry out their statutory functions and are able to finance them, and to secure the long-term resilience of water supplies and wastewater services, for example, by managing the impact of environmental pressures, population growth and customer behaviour. Those duties underpin everything that Ofwat does to drive positive outcomes for customers. Our price reviews, our major water infrastructure programme, the monitoring, compliance and enforcement work we do, what we do around markets of charging, but in particular our work on customer policy. Of particular relevance there are two things, one of which has already been mentioned. Since February 2024 there is a dedicated condition in companies' licences for customer care. That's based upon a number of principles. We have reporting and monitoring against those principles. We opened our first investigation under that condition into South East Water earlier this year. The second is the 2025 Water Special Measures Act. Customer engagement and involvement rules under the Act came into effect on the 1st of April this year. And it has three criteria, again, which we monitor performance against. And the third of the three things is our own improvements of our understanding of customers' experiences. And there are three aspects to that. The research that we conduct as a regulator with the Consumer Council for Water, with Ofgem, for example, the regular contact that we have with customers. I spoke to a customer of Severn Trent about her debt journey last Thursday, for example, and the cross-regulator work that we do as part of the UK Regulators Network with other regulators. Taken together, we think those things drive improvements in customers' experiences.
Thanks very much indeed. The report seems to suggest that people who are in financially vulnerable circumstances are reporting lower than average satisfaction levels. I wondered if each of you could say a little bit about why you think that might be.
I'll kick off.
Yeah, please, yeah.
So that's certainly correct in the energy sector. I mean, what we have seen over the last few years is a significant increase in the satisfaction of customers who are financially constrained, and that's gone up by around sort of 10% over the last few years. It still lags behind the customer satisfaction of consumers overall by about the same amount. I mean, I think there are a number of reasons for that. I mean, the obvious one, I suppose, is that customers who are struggling with their bills are unlikely, and have fallen behind with their bills, are probably unlikely to come away for a discussion with their supplier feeling positive about that. But I think there is more that can be done to try and make sure. We've made a lot of changes to our rules, and we've worked hard with suppliers who've come a long way, I think, in recent years to improve that performance, but I think there's always more they can do. So I think that there is significant pressure on customers who are struggling financially, and their household bills, people struggling with their household bills across the piece. Yeah. That is now crystallising quite a lot in energy, so I think the onus is on the energy sector, working with the government and debt charities to try and make sure that we're getting the right support to people to help them when they're in those situations.
Mm. Thanks, Tim. And Melanie and Chris, have you got any comments?
Sure. So overall, as I was saying earlier, on broadband, satisfaction is about 84%, which is quite high, I think, and it's about 4 percentage points lower for vulnerable customers. Right. So it's lower, but not. It's still, I think, at quite a high overall level. And when you look at the data, the percentage of those who are actively dissatisfied is actually the same for vulnerable or for the average customer at 7%. So there's something about, it's that grey area in the middle where people they're not happy, but they're not actively dissatisfied in a way that I think would concern us more. Now, I'm not being complacent here. Why is it lower? Well, I mean, you know, as Tim was saying, you're more likely to be struggling with bills. Overall, in broadband and mobile, the numbers are much lower in terms of debt, because the bills are lower, I think, is partly why, and also because there are options to switch and so on. But I think a lot of this comes down to, when we look at our broader customer satisfaction data, it comes to how complaints are handled, it comes to how people feel that they're treated when there's a problem. So you have to look quite broadly across the data. We publish a very broad range of data on this, I think more than most other regulators, every 2 years. And our current latest study is in field work at the moment and will come out next year.
Thank you.
Customer satisfaction and trust in the water sector is not where I want it to be. In part, that's driven by significant bill increases last year to pay for record levels of investment to safeguard the health of our waterways and to improve the resilience of our water supplies. But the most recent wave of research that we conducted with the Consumer Council for Water, which was published last week, the fieldwork for that took place in March this year, and it suggests that 1 in 5 customers are struggling to pay their water bill. That's a little bit higher than the last time we did the work, which the field work for that was in October last year. And it's about the same as the survey before that, where the field work was March 2025. So I think it's a little too early to tell what, if anything, those bill increases are having on satisfaction. However, that said, 1 in 3 customers is aware of financial support. We want that to be higher. 1 in 5 customers have contacted their water companies about support, and 1 in 10 customers have received financial support. So we have baselined companies' management of debt for 2024-25 so that we can keep monitoring and reporting on that.
That's great. Thank you very much, Steve.
Chris,
Thank you, Chair.
given the quite large increases in water bills, if 1 in 5 are struggling at the moment, isn't that only likely to increase? And therefore, what are you doing to address that problem?
It's certainly a possibility. As I've said, the latest customer research shows roughly equal numbers struggling at March this year compared to March 2005, which is when the prices went up. But we are not complacent about that. Those bill increases to support record levels of investment also came with more protection and more support for customers than ever before, so that customers' money is ring-fenced for investment and it is clawed back and returned to them if that investment doesn't arise. We also incentivise water companies to more than double the support they were giving to customers, through social tariffs. And along with our new condition, customer-focused licence condition, we are doing closer, more detailed monitoring of company performance and their performance with customers than ever before.
Thank you. Catherine, please.
Thank you. So I wanted to ask you about consumer experiences, and the sort of suggested framing of this is, what are you doing to make sure consumers have similar experiences? But I would actually frame that as what are you doing to make sure that consumers have better experiences? Because the fact is, there are a huge number of consumers that aren't having good experiences at the moment with any of the providers that you are here to regulate. So what are you doing to improve that consumer experience?
I'm happy to go first on that. I mentioned a conversation I had last week with a customer. She's a customer of Severn Trent. She lives in Nottingham, and she gave me permission to share her story with you. This is around customer support for debt and repayment in particular, which I think is quite a totemic issue. She has been enrolled on Severn Trent's Big Difference scheme, which is a social tariff providing a discount of around £400 a year for eligible customers. She had been struggling to keep up with her water bills since the start of what she called the cost of living crisis, fell into arrears and proactively contacted her water company. When she reached out for support, she didn't have to tell her story more than once. She was immediately placed on the scheme, and the discount has helped her clear her arrears. She's now able to manage her payments and keep up with her bills. Severn Trent also offered her additional support. For example, they installed a device in her water tank to reduce the amount of water she uses when she flushes her toilet. This was the first time this customer had experienced financial difficulties or fallen into debt.
Sorry to interrupt you, but what I appreciate, there will always be individual circumstances where they may have had a good experience. But the question is, what are you doing to make sure that experience overall is improved? And I think focusing on one consumer experience isn't really going to address that. what are you doing to make sure that all customers, regardless of their circumstances, get good customer service?
At the end of my conversation with Angela, the one piece of advice that she left me with is that we, and I in particular, should be doing more to share good practice like this. And I agree with her, and that's what I'm doing today. So raising awareness of support for customers who are struggling with debt, of social tariffs, and showing good examples of supporting customers experiencing those circumstances, I think, is incredibly important.
So, I mean, I guess the question is, why wouldn't that happen for everybody that has an issue? Like, why is that not happening? Is it just that they don't know how to treat customers properly?
I think we heard on the earlier panel that awareness is an issue.
Okay.
A number of the criteria in the customer focused license conditions speak to the requirement that companies have to be more proactive with their customers, and we are closely monitoring performance against that customer focused license condition for exactly that reason, so that we can be confident that, as well as us as the regulator giving examples of good practice for others to follow, that companies themselves are fulfilling their company license obligations.
And so what are the consequences for individual water companies for not responding to consumers in the way that you would expect?
If we have evidence that a company is not meeting any license condition, not just this license condition, we open an enforcement investigation. We aim to conclude those as soon as possible, often through the company offering us undertakings in lieu, as we say, of an enforcement order. That's the process.
Do you have examples of that happening?
With the customer focus license condition, we opened our first investigation in February this year into South East Water. I'm pleased to report, following the outages in Tunbridge Wells, which were, I think, incredibly difficult. The footage was incredibly difficult to see. I visited Tunbridge Wells in April, and I heard accounts from customers firsthand. The level of frustration was visceral. So that's featured in our investigation.
Presumably there's an objective standard, though. It's not based on the level of frustration of the individual customer. There must be an objective standard by which they have fallen below for you to have opened that investigation. And that sounds like it's quite new, the investigation.
It is, yes.
That hasn't been regular in the past.
It has not. That license condition is new, was new in February 2024. It has 6 principles for how we expect companies to communicate with those customers. Those communications have to be proactive. Contact with the company has to be easy. Companies must show that they are learning from customer contact experiences and sharing that learning with customers. They must show that they support customers and fix the problems that they have. They must show that they understand their customers' needs, especially the needs of vulnerable customers, and they must show that they are helping those who are struggling to pay.
Okay, some of that sounds a little bit subjective in my view, but I appreciate we can't take all the time on water. In terms of the other provision, what are we doing to make sure customers have a good experience?
We set out each year in our plan of work at Ofcom, which we consult on, what outcomes we're seeking for customers. And at a very high level, what we're seeking on the mobile and broadband side is first that people get investment, they get high quality services to start with, and that does need a lot of money spent on fibre, for example, also to fill gaps in mobile coverage. Then we require those services to be secure against cyber attack, increasingly important. There are a lot of rules on that we monitor and enforce against. And reliable in the face of things like storms. We have a scheme for auto compensation when you've had an outage, which comes in automatically, so people don't have to ask and they get the compensation if they've not had their service delivered to them. And then a lot of what's in the NAO report is about how the market works at the consumer end when people are choosing a product, being billed. And that's partly about, a lot of that's about choice. Again, in the context of broadband and mobile, very competitive markets, lots of different services on offer, can be quite confusing, but actually it's also, in many ways quite good for the customer. And that's about things being transparent. We've introduced rules on mid-contract price rises where you won't be surprised to hear I take a slightly different view to Martin Lewis. You're very happy to talk about that if the committee would like to explore it. But it's about choice, but it's about people being able to navigate as well as they can. And then finally, fairness. And a lot of that does come into vulnerable customers, I think, because anyone can be vulnerable. in the moment if they've become financially at risk, for example, or if something's happened in their household, if they've been bereaved. And so a lot of the problems are actually when somebody's got a difficulty in their own lives and they need to be treated with fairness and kindness and respect by their telecoms provider, just as everybody else. So those are the things we seek. And what we tend to do at Ofcom, we produce a lot of data, and we tend to scan that very, very actively and consult very actively externally with experts, and then tend to go in on specific issues that we believe matter in the moment. So mobile coverage is very much one of those right now, as is the switch over from the old public switch telephone network, which I was talking about earlier. So we tend to sort of direct our effort at whatever we think the problems are that need fixing.
Can I just put a challenge to you on that digital switchover?
Yes.
Because one of the issues that Martin Lewis mentioned in his evidence was the frustration with the standing charges in the energy sector. And my impression, and correct me if I'm wrong, but that we're basically introducing a standard charge for broadband access now through that transfer to digital telephone. So even if you don't have a landline, you don't use it, you have to pay a standing charge for a digital line. I'll just put that with you because I think the risk is that will go up and up and up to pay for the overall infrastructure, and question mark why we're introducing a standard charge when actually that's a source of frustration in existing public provision where the market doesn't really meet the level of competition required to keep that under control. So that's just something I wanted to put on the record with you, that I think it's a concern.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there are two things here. First, most broadband contracts these days don't vary depending on how much data you use. They used to. Data was rationed and you paid more to use more of it and less to use less of it. Now it's much more about speed, paying more for speed, although increasingly the highest speeds are actually as cheap as the lowest speeds. So if you like, the whole thing has become a standing charge. It doesn't matter how much you use, and that's very much the offer in the market. But it isn't. So the one exception to that is actually if you've still got a landline phone, where you may pay both a standing charge and sometimes still quite high rates for. I mean, we've regulated to protect against this, but actually, weirdly, if you move over to, if you're migrated over to a broadband telephone line instead, you don't pay anything beyond your broadband charge.
There is
so
a standard charge for a digital phone line. You have to pay a minimum.
Well, it's not. It's generally part of the broadband package these days because there isn't any additional infrastructure that goes with it anymore. Be really happy to pick that up afterwards because it may be somebody's on a legacy landline still that has not been properly switched off.
It may just be me.
Well, probably not, or it may just be me not quite hearing the question. But
anyway, I think we're digressing from the main consumer experience issue. And the one thing actually I noted from what you're saying is the amount of data that you collect and the data that you analyse. So I actually was going to come back to you, Mr. Walters, about data and Ofwat, because I understand that you're not so good at collecting data at Ofwat, but I'll come back to you on that, Mr. Jarvis.
Yes, so I mean, look, there's broadly three things that we do as a regulator to try and drive up customer service, and they operate in a bit of a cycle, so it's not a static thing, but we set the rules and the outcomes that we expect consumers to get, and we then monitor compliance against those. So we monitor the data in a similar way that Melanie has just described to see what's happening at an individual firm level or for particular types of consumers. And then we make sure that customers can get compensated. So where appropriate, we have similar versions of automatic compensation for certain types of things to make sure that they haven't got to go through a big process, that there's automatic compensation. And with more systematic things, we will take compliance action to drive up performance where we see particular companies operating below the standards we expect. And that approach over the last few years has driven up customer satisfaction in energy quite significantly. It's now at the highest level since we started measuring it. There's still loads to do. I think you can still drive up performance more, and I think you can particularly drive up performance more for those who are most vulnerable, as we've discussed. But those are the sort of three broad areas that we would look to do to drive up performance.
Specifically, how are you driving up that consumer experience, particularly for vulnerable customers, but for all customers, given that there is a challenge with competition in the market?
Yes. So if we give a sort of couple of examples, perhaps. So I think a few years ago, the average waiting time for people ringing up their energy supplier was around 18 minutes. Just to get through to speak to somebody in the first place. This was at the height of the crisis when, to be fair, suppliers were getting inundated with calls, but that was an unacceptably high level. We took compliance action against a specific firm in the industry to take action because they were particular outliers. They not only improved their performance, but other suppliers improved their performance on the back of that. Those average figures are down to 1.5 minutes now. And then in other areas, we have set rules for vulnerable consumers to make sure that suppliers have different ways available to customers to contact them. So as we heard previously, some customers prefer to write, some prefer email, text. So we make sure that they have different ways of contacting the most vulnerable consumers. And we have seen improvements in customer satisfaction, and I think I would, just on that last point, I would draw a distinction between those who are financially vulnerable and those who are vulnerable for other reasons. So actually, in our sector, for customers on the priority services register, their customer satisfaction is actually higher than everybody else's. It's for those customers who are struggling with their bills and financially vulnerable that we're particularly trying to drive up performance.
Yeah, that's helpful. Just to come back to Ofwat,
yes,
because my understanding is you don't collect data in the same way that Ofgem and Ofcom do. A, why not? B, are you going to do that? And C, it clearly is helpful to achieve what it is you're trying to achieve.
It is true that we don't collect data in the same way. In my opening remarks, I made reference to the way that we survey and collect information on customers more qualitatively, the regular reporting. That is because our model of economic regulation is one where companies are financially incentivized to improve customer performance through a financial measure. So that's the method that we have taken up to this point. One of the recommendations of the Independent Water Commission report that's reflected in the government's white paper and may well be given effect by the forthcoming Clean Water Bill is to look again at the way that we are incentivising customer services. That is something that we are working closely on with the government, with DEFRA, to give effect to. A second limb here, just related to what Tim was saying about vulnerable customers, is the issue of data sharing. All water companies do have data sharing sharing agreements, in place with their local electricity network, and PSR data is being shared. We think what needs to happen next is further automation of that sharing to make it more systematic, to widen out the sharing to include energy suppliers and other providers. That is a complex task. It's something that the Department of Business and Trade is looking at, and we and Ofgem are working closely with them on that.
I'll say I appreciate we're short of time, but I don't really understand why you're not collecting the data. That doesn't really answer the question, because I would have thought if you wanted things to improve, you need data to be able to drive that. So it doesn't really make sense.
And I think we agree, and one of the recommendations in the Independent Water Commission report is to do exactly that, to replace what was a financial incentive that didn't require collecting specific data with
when will that happen?
Well, that's a matter for the government and the Clean Water Bill.
Thank you, Catherine. I'm going to call Rachel next because she's got to leave to do something else. Rachel.
I'm going to be asking about Ofgem, but Mr. Walters, I have to say to you, I spot a PR man when I see one, and one swallow does not a summer make. One lady from Nottingham does not make up for the hundreds of my constituents who have been struggling with South West Water, including one family who has spent 4 years sweeping somebody else's faeces out of their back garden. Anyway, we will move on to Ofgem. So, Mr. Jarvis, we all recognise that rising consumer debt in the energy sector, as indeed in other sectors, is a problem, not surprisingly, in the circumstances that we find ourselves. So, how are you addressing the practices within the energy industry that exacerbates consumer debt, which we saw the previous panel reference in passing, not in depth? And to follow on from that, how are you addressing the practices within the energy industry that will help with introducing the debt relief scheme?
Yes, so to start off on the things that I think that are in our gift and are very much in the control of suppliers that they can do. So, as I mentioned earlier, we've done a lot to try and tighten our rules and monitor compliance with the accuracy of bills, making sure that people are getting accurate bills in a timely way. That's an ongoing process, and that helps prevent people getting debt in the first place. We have a specific focus at the moment on the house move process, the home move process, as Martin Lewis referred to. This is an area where suppliers estimate around 20 to 30% of the debt arises through that process. So that's at both ends of that process. So as people move out with debt, but also as people move into a property, the average waiting time for somebody to contact a supplier and to set up an account is around 70 days now. Now, at current energy prices, that person's already £300 in debt before we start. So that is an area of significant focus to us. We're consulting at the moment on new rules and guidance in that space. So I think we can drive up performance there and help reduce that level of debt. But I think sitting on top of that is a fundamental challenge that we have, that the data suggests that the main problem, the main driver of the rise in energy debt is the size of the bill and people's ability to pay. So we have seen an increase in the number of people falling into debt and arrears of around 7%. It is dwarfed by the amount that they are in debt. So what that is suggesting to us that it is largely the same people and the same households are struggling, but their debt is going up because of the size of the energy bill. So I think that's an area where I think we would look to work with government and with debt charities to try and support households who are in energy debt. I think we're seeing a disproportionate amount of household debt now falling in energy. I think there's a multitude of complex reasons for that. But I think that is something that we can't solve on our own, and we need to work with government. You mentioned the debt relief scheme.
Which neatly takes us on to the debt relief scheme.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, this is something that we've been concerned about energy debt for a while. We've worked with consumer groups and suppliers to try and develop a scheme that tackles the historical debt that people have built up, particularly during the crisis, where despite the support from government, energy prices were so high, and they're still sitting on a lot of that debt. So we worked on a scheme to try and write some of that debt off. Now, effectively, what that is doing is moving money between different types of consumers. That is something that raises all sorts of questions about rights and responsibilities and the transfer of money from one group of people to another. That's very much a government something that government needs to approve. Government is looking at that scheme and is looking at that scheme in the context of any support that it might need to provide in the winter, depending on what happens in the Middle East. So that scheme at the moment is with government to look at what might be made available to consumers to try and tackle some of that historical debt.
You must have had some data that you can feed into government to advise them. I don't think you can. I'm sure washing your hands and passing the buck is something that you would never consider doing, but I'm really hopeful that you would be a bit more proactive and perhaps a bit more punchy when you're dealing with the government on debt relief.
Yes, look, I mean, we have been very loud about debt and the need for debt relief, to be honest, and we have developed this scheme. We have presented a huge amount of data and worked with government on what we think is needed. I'm very happy to be punchy on debt. I think it's important. I think it's the biggest challenge for the sector. But I think for very good reasons, I can't sort of tax one group of consumers and give that money to another group of consumers. Okay. That's very much the role of it.
4 out of 10 as a starter. See you here next year.
Right, thank you very much,
Thank you,
Rachel.
Geoffrey.
It falls to me. Now, fairly simple question to all three of you. Why are companies not directing customers to the relevant alternative dispute resolution service when they want to complain? And equally, why are you not using that resolution dispute services to collect and understand the addresses barriers to the complaint processes? Start with you. Let's just go straight across the room. Start with you, Tim.
I think we are working very closely with the Ombudsman. We have a very close relationship with the Ombudsman and use their data and use their insight about people's experience when they're raising a complaint, and we use that to play back into our rules and how we monitor. I think you're quite right about the signposting to alternative dispute resolution, and that's not That's not been as good as it should be. We've worked with the supplier on their processes, supporting a trial with them to improve the referral process. And we've been taking action with individual suppliers, getting them all on improvement plans to improve their signposting. So the worst performing, I think, has just increased by around 20%. So we've pushed that number up. It's still too low, to be honest, and we are still working with suppliers to improve the way that they signpost people to the Ombudsman, and the government is also looking at the rules around the Ombudsman, so that's the period over which time, how long before somebody can go to an Ombudsman, which is the government's proposing to reduce, and also looking at trialling sort of automatic referrals to try and speed up that process and make it easier for people.
Thank you. Melanie, please.
Yeah, so the NAO report flagged a couple of things which were very helpful, and they all came out of our own published data last year. And there was definitely a question. I think 64% of those complaining about broadband were satisfied that the contact details were easy to find. So we actually went in to the companies, and we've got some changes, so improvements to training in call centres about the difference between a query and a complaint, for example, different signposting on websites and on bills. So we've gone in on those specifics, and it was quite helpful. There was also a specific issue with one of the adjudicators feeling that they weren't being properly referred to by one of the companies, and we went in specifically again with that company. More broadly, we've just done a review of alternative dispute resolution, and I think we're the first regulator to do this. We've just cut the number of weeks from 8 to 6, after which, if your complaint hasn't been resolved to your satisfaction, you can go to the ADR service. That used to be 12 about 15 years ago. We cut it to 8. And now with digital communications and speed, we think 6 is appropriate. And there's a bunch of customers who wait that final 2 weeks, nothing happens. They should be able to move straight to ADR. So we've just done that, and we will monitor that. The final thing to say is that at Ofcom we do have our own small but rather brilliant contact centre based in Warrington, and the public can call and complain to us about anything they like. We can't deal with their specific complaint. Sometimes we get TV programmes and broadband all in the same phone call, but we do use that data, and in fact we are just concluding, and I hope we will be announcing in the next week or two, a pretty significant investigation into customer service with Virgin Media O2, which looks at many aspects of call handling, whether or not people were allowed easily to leave their contract when they wanted to, and also whether or not they were referred to alternative dispute resolution. So we do using all the tools at our disposal. We're changing the rules, monitoring and taking enforcement action when we need to, and we'll write to the committee when that is concluded.
Very helpful, thank you. Chris.
Thank you.
In the water industry.
The Consumer Council for Water provides those services. We work very closely with CCW, as you heard on the last panel, as I set out earlier, particularly around customer research to understand the customer journey better. The dedicated conditioning companies licenses for customer care has principles that strengthen that. I think the Clean Water Bill, the forthcoming Clean Water Bill, and the proposals in the government's white paper will go further, and I think that will strengthen customer representation. In addition to that, the relevant measures in the Water Special Measures Act, which came into force on the 1st of April this year, stipulate that water company decisions have to be informed by customers' views. Decision-making arrangements in companies have to involve customers, and companies must demonstrate that they understand the impact of their past decisions on customers, which again I think strengthens the redress route that customers have. We receive around 300 direct contacts from customers every month, and my excellent customer inquiries team does its best to direct customers to the right source of information for them.
So the second bit of that question, why are you not using the data that dispute resolution services collect to understand and address the barriers to the complaints process?
We are beginning to use that data from CCW now. As I set out in answer to an earlier question, those sort of direct measures of experience in our current system have been less relevant to us. One of the recommendations of the Independent Water Commission report as captured in the white paper, and I imagine taken forward in the Clean Water Bill, is to think again about how customer experience is incentivised in the water industry to move away from that more arm's length financial incentive.
Melanie answered the question a bit about data. Tim, you didn't really talk about data, using the data.
We do have a close relationship with the Ombudsman and use their data and use that to flag issues. It's part of our horizon scanning, so we work closely with them and monitor areas where there are, if we're seeing spikes in certain types of complaints, we will take compliance action. We'll start compliance action on the back of that data.
Okay, thank you very much. Sarah Olney, please.
Thank you, Chair. Chris, I was interested to see in the report that actually Ofwat have not been monitoring the amount that customers owe to water companies for very long at all, only since 2023-2024, and yet by 2025 customer debt to water companies totaled 2.9 billion, which is an extremely significant sum. Just over 4 million household accounts are in debt. But given that Ofwat have not been monitoring this level of consumer debt for very long at all, what are you able to tell us about what the drivers of consumer debt are in the water sector?
The monitoring that we started was built on guidelines that we published in May 2022 in the expectation that water bills were going to rise in the last price review, which they did, and also our December 2023 publication on customer vulnerability. They underpin our dedicated customer condition. In expectation of that, we began, as you said, monitoring customer data. We published our first monitoring of that in January 2025 analysis of household debt, which was reflected in the NAO's report. It showed that 8% of households were in arrears by around £800. 1 in 3.
80%, did you say?
8%. 8%.
Right, gosh, sorry. Thank you for clarifying.
8% of households were in arrears by around £800. 1 in 3 customers in arrears are enrolled on repayment plans, which I think is these customers have lower arrears, so that when a customer is enrolled on a payment plan, that payment plan works. And our 9th wave of customer research joint with Consumer Council for Water, which was published last week. I touched on that earlier. In addition to that, we are engaged in cross-regulator horizon scanning through the UK regulator.
Can I just quickly ask you, my question was about what causes customers to get into debt with their water companies?
The evidence in the cost of living report suggests that it's seen as part of a wider part of a cost of living crisis. Even though water bills can be quite modest in comparison to other utilities, over half of customers report that they are struggling to pay bills, and that includes water bills. So I think it's difficult to identify a separate driver.
So no water-specific reason.
Not on the basis of the research that we currently have. I think we must continue to look at that, especially in view of the significant bill increases from April of last year.
Are you expecting further significant rises this year?
The profile of bills for this current 5-year period from 2025 up to 2030 is set out, save for additions for inflation. So they vary from one area of the country to another quite significantly in some cases, but in broad brush terms, customers' bills are set for roughly a 5-year period now. The next 5-year period, it's not possible to say what bill increases are going to be because they will be determined by the amount of investment that is needed, and it's just too early to know that.
So in your earlier answer, you said only 1 in 3 of customers who were in arrears were on a repayment plan, but also that where customers are on a repayment plan, their arrears are lower. So what are you doing to work with water companies to make sure that more people get onto those repayment plans? And does the regulator think that the repayment plans are sufficient in their current form?
As a result, in tandem with the bill increases to support record levels of investment, companies doubled the number of households eligible for financial support from 4% to 9% to give more protection for customers. We think that using the new conditions, customer-focused license conditions that we've had since 2024, we can and will push companies to do more, to raise awareness of the support that's available for customers, and we will actively monitor companies to ensure that they are communicating proactively with their customers. And
will there be penalties if you think that they're not doing enough?
As with any license condition, if we identify a breach of a license condition, a company can be fined up to 10% of its turnover. It can offer us undertakings in lieu of that fine. It's important to note fines are not paid by customers. They don't show up on customer bills. They are paid by companies and investors.
Thank you. I'm going to move on to question 8.
Yes, please.
So I want to I'm going to stick with you, Chris. I've got a few questions now about the Priority Services Register, which in the report we know that there are 30 needs codes describing characteristics that would make a customer eligible to go on the Priority Services Register. What lessons have you learned about the impact of the PSR process on customers with extra communication, access or safety needs?
So we published pilot research in understanding customers' PSR journeys in 2024, which we followed up with full research with Tim, with Ofgem, on experiences of customers in vulnerable circumstances. That research led to our 2024 PSR standards and guidance, which took effect on the 1st of April 2025. I'd be happy to write back to the committee with details of that research, with more details of that research. Our October 2025 research confirmed that the reach of the water sector's PSR is improving from 2% to 13% of household bills. That is low compared to energy. I accept that, and we do need to do more about it, especially because we found that about 50% of households may be eligible to be on their company's PSR, but are not yet. The eligibility criteria that you mentioned are very broad. Being a pensioner is one of them, but clearly not all pensioners require that kind of help. But what we need to do is we need to, in order to grow the number of customers on a water company's PSR, that growth has to happen sustainably, and it must prioritise the households that really need the support. Offers of support must be actionable through companies' operations, and we must monitor that against the company's customer care licence condition and take action where that's not the case. Not being on the PSR before an incident occurs doesn't mean that a customer does not get help. When incidents begin, customers often self-declare as needing help, and companies should do their best to support that. And again, as a backstop, we have a licence condition that we can use to enforce that.
So can I just give a particular example of an incident occurring, which we heard about in our pre-panel? Big water outage in Tunbridge Wells before Christmas. I'm sure I don't need to remind you about that. But we heard about the water companies delivering water, presumably in large plastic bottles, to vulnerable customers, people in vulnerable situations on the PSR, but that these large deliveries were being left at the end of people's driveways for people with mobility issues. So clearly that's no good to them. So can you talk a little bit more about what Ofwat are doing to encourage water companies, when they're operating their PSR, to think about what actual customers' actual needs are and how they can properly respond to those?
Yeah, so in that particular case, that example is entirely consistent with the other evidence that we gathered that led us to open the investigation into South East Water. Since South East Water appeared before the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs Select Committee, it has pivoted its approach to us as the regulator. I am confident the company will offer undertakings to resolve that problem. That kind of enforcement is a backstop. We would much rather that companies behave more proactively.
Can I just ask, sorry to interrupt you, but you mentioned in your earlier answer about how you have issued guidance on PSRs to water companies. In that particular example that was highlighted to us, does that go against the guidance that you have issued?
Yes, it does. And it is, again, it's an ongoing investigation, so there's a limit to how much I can say, but examples like that are consistent with the evidence that we have gathered. As I've said, I think the company's stance towards its regulator has changed, and I anticipate being able to get a resolution to that issue sooner rather than later. What I was going to come on to talk about was the customer engagement and involvement rules in the Water Special Measures Act that came into force on the 1st of April 2026, which mean that companies now have to demonstrate to us that their decisions are informed by customers' views, so that customers understand what companies are doing, that their decision-making arrangements within the company involve customers, and that they demonstrate to the regulators and to customers that they understand the impact of their past decisions on customers. And I think that gives the customer a much louder voice in decision-making by the company, backed up by the customer-focused licence condition and the enforcement action that can follow.
Thank you very much. Tim, I want to ask you some similar questions about how the PSRs work in the energy sector. What lessons have Ofgem been able to learn about operating the PSRs?
So I think we've been pretty successful in getting people onto the PSR and increasing the proportions and numbers on it. And I think that the PSR was originally set up to try and address concerns about people who were vulnerable for some sort of outage, particularly sort of electricity. And I think for that purpose, it still broadly works. I think that the challenge we've got is whether it is that helpful for trying to help identify people who are financially vulnerable, and the conflation of the two, I think, to be honest, is not super helpful. Mm-hmm. So a supplier might get somebody onto the priority services register. Somebody might have young children. That is important in the event of a power outage, because you want to make sure that household is not in trouble as a result of the power going out. It's not necessarily very helpful in identifying whether that person's able to pay their bill or is struggling with other household bills. So I think we work closely with other regulators and are supportive of the government's work to try and get a single PSR. I think that is helpful, but I think there is, to be honest, a more fundamental question about what do we want to use it for, and where is it most useful.
That's interesting, but do you find that Ofgem's advice to energy companies is around the PSR is focused on vulnerability in the event of an outage?
Well, what we focus on is making sure that suppliers make a point of asking customers if they questions that will establish whether they are eligible to go onto the PSR, and then putting them on it if they are, and we push that hard and we monitor closely, and we've driven up performance in that sector. So they are then on that, flagged on their systems, and they're flagged with the distribution company if it goes down.
And what are you doing to ensure that you've got sort of consistent levels of application of PSR across energy companies?
So we're consistent in terms of the identification of people who are eligible to go on it. So we make this quite clear needs codes that are applied, and that there are questions that suppliers can ask to make sure that people go on it. So in that sense, it is consistent. There's then a question of well, what does that mean for that individual consumer? So there is an overlap between some of these things. So, for example, if somebody is contacting their supplier and they are hard of hearing, or they might need a different way of contacting them, then there are requirements on suppliers to find ways to make sure that they can meet the needs of that particular consumer. So when it comes to the distribution companies, those identity of those people is flagged, so that in the event of an outage they can make sure that they can contact them and identify whether they need help.
I can't remember if you or Mr. Walters who said earlier something like close to 50% of customers are now on the PSR, but in the event of an outage, how can you use the PSR to identify those people who are most immediately in urgent need? I'm thinking of somebody, for example, on a dialysis machine or something like that, urgently will need support, as opposed to people whose needs are important but less urgent.
So I think that is one of the challenges. There are needs codes, so that there should be codes for people, for example, on dialysis, or people who, for example, who need stair lifts or hoists and electric beds, for example, so that if there's a power outage, there's a particular issue. So that those codes should be recorded with the priority services register, so that there's suppliers know what it is that the issue is.
Thank you. And the same to Chris. Are you confident that the way the PSR is structured with the needs codes, that in the event of an outage, and you've had quite a bit of experience recently, that the right people are getting the right support at the right time?
That information is captured in the needs codes in the way that Tim explained. It's the responsibility of the water company to do that prioritisation, and our responsibility to incentivise them to do that and to hold them to account if they do not, in a very similar way that happens in energy.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Sarah. I've got a question arising from Sarah's question to you, Chris, please. I think I heard you say that 17% of customers are currently on a PSR, and you estimate that it could be as much as 50%. Is that correct?
It's the number of customers on a PSR has gone up from 2% to 13, not 17, 13%.
13. So it's even bigger than I thought. So there's a lot of work to be done. And you said you would be pressing the water companies to publicise this fact. Can you put a little bit of meat on those bones? Because that really is not a great situation. And can I give you an example, the gambling industry. Now, the gambling industry, when they were worried about addiction, made the gambling companies in their adverts actually advertise the fact of the existence of gambling aware. So much so that the gambling companies now make a virtue out of necessity. They just, every time they advertise the fact that you shouldn't be gambling so long or so much or have a break or whatever. What more are you really going to do in the water industry to resolve this issue?
When I described the customer focused licence conditions that companies now have as of February 2024, I talked about 6 different principles. Those principles are specific enough for us to be able to be more directive about what we think companies should be doing, and we are doing that, and we can hold them to account against that customer focused licence condition. I also mentioned the provisions in the Water Special Measures Act for customer involvement and engagement, which gives customers more of a voice inside the company. We are pushing companies hard to do this. You heard on the earlier panel the view of CCW that they would like us to push even harder. I hear that loud and clear. It is something that we are considering.
This committee will be pushing you too in that direction, but we'll wait and see. Anna, please.
Yes, so I think, Melanie, you were earlier saying sort of levels of debt within the mobile and broadband are sort of generally lower. But in the pre-panel, we were hearing that there currently isn't any statutory advice service or debt counselling service for broadband and mobile customers in the same way that there is CCW and citizens' advice for energy. Would you be supportive of there being more sort of statutory advice available and support for your customers who find themselves in debt or in more challenged circumstances?
Look, I think that would be a decision for the government, and I think it's a question really of where you think the biggest problems are that need to be fixed. So on the back of the NAO report, and I've experienced enough NAO reports into organisations I've led to know there's always some things in there that you didn't know and that you want to follow up. And we want to follow up on disconnections, which is related because the numbers seem on the high side at 1% every 6 months, and we just don't know whether that's customers deciding to disconnect when they move house with maybe a month of debt, not maybe particularly serious, but they might get a credit rating that they don't want, or is it something that's more about the way that companies are behaving? So we're going to look into that. And I think when it comes to debt, I mean, we will uncover, I think, a little bit more insight through that work into that. I would say that I think, and this came out in the earlier session, that probably social tariffs are the area where we would suggest the government could, that would be the area I would push harder. Although there are consequences if you get very widespread adoption of social tariffs, you will almost certainly increase bills elsewhere because companies will respond. You push the balloon too far in one direction and it pops out in another. But that would be my suggestion there.
And perhaps clearer than on either of the other two sectors, it's clear that the most engaged customers, switchers, although I think I may put this point to Tim as well, are the ones who get the sort of advantage. And, this idea that there are going to be some people who just, for different reasons, they may not be in vulnerable circumstances, it might not be financial vulnerability, but are basically face barriers to switching. So what are you doing as a regulator to just try and make sure that you are protecting, I think in Martin Lewis's terms were sort of I don't know if it was something like legitimate or illegitimate sort of, reasons why. For me it's probably just because I am slightly time poor and just don't get round as a parliamentarian to shopping around for my bills. But for others, like the example I gave of family members, that sort of switching is just not something that they're very confident to do. So how are you protecting, you know, in that market, and ensuring that those who are less engaged have similar protections to those that you might call vulnerable?
Yeah, so switching is important, and it's. I think we have higher levels of switching than in any other utility. It's because it's a much more competitive market. It's really quite different. It's just over a quarter of customers switch one or both of mobile and broadband every year. So switching is high, but you're absolutely right. Not everyone does it. Clearly, 3/4 of people don't do it every year, and so we don't over rely on it. I think some of the things we've done in the last few years to increase protections are, for example, getting agreement that practice that used to happen was that you would be left continuing to pay the amount that was for your phone as part of your monthly bill, even after you'd already paid it off. I mean, we've probably all know someone who's done that. I did it myself before I came to Ofcom, and then you realise that you've been paying this money that's just for nothing. We got a voluntary agreement on that a few years ago, and that practice, if that's still happening, and you suggested earlier it was, then we're concerned about that and would want to hear about it. We've also introduced, you know, end of contract notifications. Again, that should be standard now across the industry, so people know when their contract's coming up. And we've outlawed this sort of inflation plus, you know, mid-contract price rise. If I could just say briefly in response to Martin Lewis earlier, the context here is that broadband pricing is falling. So a few years back, it would cost you 50 quid or so to get any kind of decent speed on fibre, and now that's more like 34 pounds a month is the sort of average that people pay. And but then when you look at what the first year discounts are, I was checking this morning, you know, 22, 25, 28 pounds that I could get at my home address for fibre, you know, for the first year. So that increase is on a heavily discounted price. And I worry that if you flatten the increase, you basically reduce you get rid of the discounting, and that will, you know, that's just a different kind of market. It's flatter, it's less dynamic. There are choices here, but that would be one of the consequences. And the other thing I would say is that, and I don't think people maybe perhaps talk about this enough, is that if you still leave people, as Martin is suggesting, on inflation-based increases, then that means that when you have Russia invading Ukraine, or the current uncertainty about Iran and what it's going to do to energy prices and inflation this winter, you are leaving people once again at the mercy of something that our research showed they don't understand inflation. People don't understand CPI. They don't really know what it means. So giving them an inflation-based contract, I think, is potentially really not great for the majority of consumers. So, and you know, what I can say with certainty is if you're already on one of these contracts, you don't have to worry about your mobile or broadband bill going up in a way that you weren't expecting next April if inflation goes up this winter. So I think it's a very dynamic, mobile and broadband are very dynamic. They're more complicated in a way than water and electricity, and we rely more on the market to serve consumers. The data we publish is company by company, which really focuses their mind on how they all benchmark. We drive that pretty hard. I'm not complacent about there still being issues. I've mentioned some of them already, but we try to sort of spot the problems and then go after them.
Thank you. I think we've touched a bit in the other two sectors on the levels of debt and sort of repayment plans, but I do just want to push a little bit on the sort of levels in water are still very low, with only 26% of sort of households who have a water debt being on a repayment plan. That seems very, very low. So forgive me if you feel you've already sufficiently answered it, but what more are you doing to make sure that companies are proactively helping to get people onto repayment plans? And do you think that they're sufficiently affordable that people can actually, you know, it is in their interest to move on to them?
I think in terms of getting more customers onto the right repayment plan for them, it is a combination of two of the things I've spoken about earlier, which is more of a customer voice within the company, within the organisation, in terms of its decision making, because of the customer engagement provisions in the Water Special Measures Act, and it is that backstop I described of us inserting a new condition to focus more on customers into companies' licences and being able to take enforcement decisions against that if we don't. I also think it is incumbent on us and companies to share examples of best practice that are out there. I gave one earlier just to raise awareness in the public as well. And I think the combination of public awareness raising, having more of a customer voice in company decision making, and that legal backstop, which is prescriptive about how companies are supposed to engage with their customers, should be sufficient to drive the improvements.
In the spirit of sort of naming and shaming then, if 26% is the average across the sector, who are the good and bad companies when it comes to repayment plans? What's the highest and lowest percentage you've got?
I don't have that information to hand. I'd be happy to write back to the committee.
Okay, well that would be very useful. And obviously it's a little higher in the energy sector, Tim, at 40%, but I presume you're not being complacent and making sure that the energy companies aren't either. But obviously for some of the customers, the repayment plans, I've certainly had one of my own constituents where there was just no hope of him ever repaying on the sort of state pension credit that he was on. So how are you actually making decisions to allow effectively to get rid of debt if it's just simply not ever going to be repaid, rather than it hanging around people and causing them, ongoing stress?
Yeah, so I mean, we've got a sort of model, I suppose, that's somewhere in between the two you've just heard about, in a sense, in that this is a competitive market. So if customers are not paying their bills, the suppliers are incentivised to get in touch with them and to get them onto repayment plans. And we certainly encourage them to do that, but they're also heavily incentivised to do it. We have rules that ensure or aim to ensure that those repayment plans are reasonable and that people are not asking for amounts that are unreasonable, and we monitor that, and we have taken action there. But I think it's important to note that while the supplier might be heavily incentivised to get people on a repayment plan, it takes both sides to engage on that, and there are a number of challenges here. There's getting in touch with the customer, they're getting them to engage with their supplier. People, if they are in debt to their energy supplier, they tends to be the last person they want to contact, frankly. So that is a big challenge. So I think, look, we will always push more suppliers to do as much as they can to engage their customers, and I think they're heavily incentivised to do so. But we have to accept, I think, that the rise in energy debt is not something that the suppliers are going to be able to solve on their own.
The thing I seem to sort of be hearing in general is a lack of proactivity, a lack of clear communication. We sort of heard that from the previous panel, bits of information hidden at the bottom of bills, not actually telling people what they are and aren't able to access. So just briefly back to Melanie, if I may. Where you've got these voluntary agreements on things like end of contract notifications, how confident are you? Are you really monitoring that? And what consequences are there if companies are not complying?
Absolutely, we monitor it. And I was saying earlier, the data we publish in our various reports is company by company as well as the averages. And the chief executives are well aware of where they benchmark compared to their competitors. And they talk to me about it when our reports hit and they look into it. So look, sometimes a voluntary approach is the right one because it gets you there quicker. And sometimes you can go further than we can with our powers. So where we can, we'll always, do that. And if we think we need a rule, then that's what we'll do. Can I just add that we have done quite a bit of work amongst ourselves and with the Financial Conduct Authority on customers in financial difficulty and debt collection. We've written to the various providers in our industries in 2023 and 2024 on each of those. So we've tried to join up and make things a bit easier. And I know that sometimes it can be difficult to see the different rules that are in place in different organisations, but we have consciously tried to address that. Given the complexities, there's always going to be some differences.
Yeah. And would that be guidance in terms of bailiffs and going right down the sort of where do you go if, in terms of guidance to debt collectors?
We've written letters to the companies in our sectors, setting out our expectations jointly, so that they can see that we're joining up and can see that demand, if you like. And that was 2023 on customers in financial difficulty and 2024 on debt collection. And that's kind of post the Russia invading Ukraine sort of cost of living crisis. We've also got a leaflet on cost of living, which we make available to organisations like Citizens Advice and others who directly help consumers. So again, they can see what's there. At Ofcom, significantly brushing up our website, which is great in some places and not so great in others, and we will be launching what we're calling a customer hub on telecoms in the next few months to support people through this winter in particular, make sure people are aware of their rights, of how the rules work, of where they can get help and so on. So that will drop, I hope, soon after the summer holidays.
And is there guidance across? It's good to hear that you have been working, but on this issue of sort of affordability, and is there any citing on if people are indebted on their water bills, on their council tax, on their energy bills? You know, I think this idea of accumulated debt that is considered when agreeing a repayment plan in terms of assessing affordability. You're nodding, Tim. Do you want to say on the
so
record?
we've done a lot of work with debt charities on this and trying to get and we're trying to look at standardising the information that consumers can provide, so that we can make sure that the whole of the household finances and the debt challenges are taken into account in repayment plans. And so there's work ongoing there with debt charities on that.
I think that's it.
Thank you, Anna. Now I'm going to appeal for short questions and short answers. The hour is getting quite late. As an exemplar of short questioning, Rupert Lowe.
Well, you chopped me off if I asked too long, Geoffrey. Yes, I think my question is for you, Chris. I just wanted to ask you, I mean, where in the list of your priorities do customers, and particularly financially vulnerable customers, where do they rank in your priority?
Well, our primary duties are to customers. We have 3 customer-focused duties. They feature in all the tools that Ofwat has, our price reviews, our oversight and support for major water investment programs, what we do around monitoring, casework and enforcement, what we do around markets and charging, but in particular, what we do around customer policy, courtesy of the customer-focused licence condition that water companies now have since February 2024, and the provisions of the Water Special Measures Act on company engagement with their customers. So I think the customer interest is front and centre in the economic regulation of water and wastewater services.
Okay, so if I look at figure 2, there's an energy ombudsman and there's a communication ombudsman. There doesn't appear to be an ombudsman for water. Is CCW performing that function?
CCW is performing that function.
They are performing that function. They are performing the function of the ombudsman, are they?
I think there is a complication around CCW's performing of that function. They were until very recently performing that function. Yes, I'd be happy to either us or CCW write back.
Because the chap running it, this chap Rob Wilson, as you know, is under investigation for fraud, as I understand it here, fraud investigation, and he's also when he was in Parliament, I think he claimed 9p for going 322 metres on a car journey. So that doesn't fill me with huge confidence. But
I was unaware of that.
And on that, well, it's in the Daily Telegraph. On that, I think I'm right in saying that the complaints to CCW for billing were up 63%, and for affordability were up 110%. Does that sound right to you?
I think as a result of the pretty significant bill increases in April last year to fund record levels of investment, we were anticipating more customers contacting CCW with difficulties around.
Is that right? So because it's hardly surprising, given that the real cost of water is up 20% over the last 4 years. So it's disappointing, I think, therefore, just to see that there's actually only a 13% take up in this PSR. And I think that doesn't reflect well on you, and particularly when the report actually tells us that there are up to 50% of households who are in need of this.
I agree. We welcome the NAO's findings and we accept their recommendations, one of which is for us to try harder to improve that. As I said in answer to an earlier question, if 50% of households might be eligible to be on PSR and only 13% are, there is a gap in what companies are doing, but there is a gap in what the regulator's doing. I accept that in terms of raising awareness.
And one other thing I'd like to clear up with you is am I right in saying that under your permitted playing fair rules that bailiffs are an acceptable way to proceed? Because it appears that the use of bailiffs is on the increase, not the decrease.
So our paying fair guidelines set out principles and minimum expectations for services. They do have criteria around bailiffs. There was an increase in use of bailiffs.
Are you increasingly using bailiffs?
Ofwat does not use bailiffs.
Well, are they being increasingly used by the industry?
There was an increase in bailiff use after the pandemic. It's
I mean, you should have an interest in this, shouldn't you? I mean, you may not be actually doing it yourself, but you should have an interest in it.
We do have an interest in that, precisely because our paying fair guidelines do have requirements about how we treat customers in debt. Companies should be clear, courteous and non-threatening to customers. All communication should be designed around customer need. Fair tools should be used, for example, not threatening to disconnect water company. Customers cannot be disconnected from water and wastewater services, and only not using void property notices as debt collection tool. And enforcement action, i.e. bailiffs, should only be used as a last resort once all other options for repayment have been exhausted. Those paying fair guidelines are now enshrined in that customer focused licence condition I talked about. We are monitoring that much more actively, and if we find bad practices, we will not hesitate to use those powers and take enforcement action against companies.
Yes, I think until you've got the number of people actually on the PSR up, the use of bailiffs, in my opinion, should be used sparingly, and only for good reason. And I think my colleagues have quite ably underlined the need for you to make sure that your customers do understand how they can apply for this financial help.
Yeah, we agree, and we intend to play our part in raising awareness for exactly that reason.
And do you think it's wise that CCW are the ombudsman effectively for the industry? I mean, do you have a view on that?
I accept the premise of the question completely. That it's vital, in my view, that there is a customer voice in company decision making that is backed by credible legal requirements. It is a matter for government what form that voice takes in the new integrated regulator for England and the separate regulatory system for Wales. To my mind, it is crucial that there is a customer voice. The form it takes is a matter for government.
Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Rupert. We now move on to Clive, please.
Yes, moving on to social tariffs, to Ofwat and Ofcom. Customers are entitled in certain circumstances. The fact that millions of customers who are entitled are not claiming them, is it your fault or the company's fault?
Are you asking me to answer that one first? Yes, absolutely. Well, look, over the last 5 years, Ofcom really lent into this, to be honest, during COVID, and we got the number of offers out there in the industry up from 3, there weren't really any, frankly, to 20, and we've seen take-up go from 50,000 a year to more than 500,000 a year. But it has got stuck at 8.5%, 9.5% over the last few years. Awareness, again, was extremely low. It's now about a third, but it's not budging and it's not getting any higher. We've talked to the government about this. We've talked to the companies about this. We require good signposting on websites and so on of what's on offer. I think what Martin Lewis said earlier about price comparison sites is interesting, and we'll follow that up actually about whether we could talk to them about having social tariffs a bit more visible. But fundamentally, I think in the end what is now needed is for the government's insight into those who are eligible, particularly those who are on benefit via the Department for Work and Pensions, to sort of think actually what would help to move the dial on this. If the government wants to go further, I think we've got to think more deeply about what's going on, why people aren't taking them up. We've done research on this, and certainly on the mobile side, it's because there are very, very cheap offers available, particularly SIM only, and it's less necessary for a lot of customers to have a social tariff. But on the broadband side, it's sometimes about people wanting to, for example, still have pay TV and broadband together. Most of the social tariffs are just broadband only because they are designed to be that bit more of a basic.
Try and the range of social tariffs to incorporate not just broadband.
Well, if you wanted to make it a requirement on the industry, which is the case in some other European countries, there was a question about that earlier, so some other European countries have a regulated social tariff, then that would be a decision for the government. I think if we're going to really get much more progress here, it needs the government's insight and, if you like, machinery and perspective on what's going on with those customers. For us, our social tariffs are about benefits, and that's the eligibility, and that's where it comes from. So it would be very much the DWP. And I think the government are talking to each other about that. The only issue is, I think if you push it very far, you will end up with the rest of the market probably paying high prices. So I think at some point, broadband and mobile are highly competitive. Margins are not there's not a sort of huge amount of slack in the system. If any of the companies were here, they would tell you that. And we've unleashed huge competition on broadband in recent years, which is driving pricing down. So the more you support the more vulnerable financially, the more you may find that those who are slightly next up the rung of the ladder might then find that they can't get quite the discounts. So that's why I think you may have been saying earlier, I think this is quite an important quite an important policy question, really, as to what kind of market you want.
Okay, for Ofwat it's different, isn't it? Because there isn't any competition. People either have a social tariff or they pay more. So why are you not doing more to make sure that social tariffs are more widely known?
There is no competition in the household market. There is competition for business retail. I know our focus today is the household market.
Social tariff is domestic, isn't it?
It is, yes. The social tariff is domestic. I think unlike telecommunications and energy, there is no national market for water. There is no water grid. What we have is a series of regional monopolies.
I understand that. So why are not more people who are entitled to social tariffs being put on them? That's surely a failure of yourself or the companies to make sure people know about them, isn't it?
As a result of the last price review, the number of customers eligible for social tariffs was doubled by companies. All companies have increased their offering. As a result of the changes to the legislation and the customer licence that I talked about earlier, there is now more of a customer voice in company decision making, and there is now more of a legal backstop to ensure that customers...
But there's still a lot of customers who aren't aware things that they should be entitled to.
I accept that.
Whose failure is that?
I accept that we as the regulator need to do more to raise awareness, and the whole sector needs to do more to raise awareness. And as I've set out, I think in answer to a number of previous questions, that is something that we intend to do.
What's the time scale to do more?
Well, we're in the process of a transition program, which is bringing together the functions of Ofwat with the Environment Agency, the Drinking Water Inspectorate, Natural England, and establishing a separate system for Wales. A number of the recommendations around that do talk to strengthening the customer voice. So changes to that process will be changes to how we
wait for all that reorganisation to actually improve the understanding of customers about entitlement to social tariffs.
Well, we continue to conduct research to understand.
Look, there's a lot of people out there who are paying more than they need to. So whose job it is to make sure that they're aware of the social tariffs? Whose job?
It is a collective responsibility of the regulator and the water companies, and we have the tools and the backing to give effect to that, and that's what we intend to do.
When?
We need to do this in parallel with work to establish a new integrated water regulators, precisely because a number of the recommendations in the Independent Water Commission report and the Water White Paper talk about strengthening the customer voice. So anything that we do collectively, regulator and companies as a sector, has to be consistent with what the direction of travel for the new regulator is. Those things have to be seen as two.
You haven't got a time scale.
Well, the establishment of the new water regulator is a matter for government, but we
can't do anything without changes.
It's not that we can't do anything.
What can you do then?
What I've already set out is to raise awareness collectively, us and the companies, by encouraging companies, by using the powers that we have to encourage companies to be more proactive.
Any company not using its powers.
We opened our first investigation under that customer-focused licence condition earlier this year into South East Water. That is investigations ongoing as a result of South East Water appearing before the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs Select Committee. I'm confident they'll come forward and engage with us in a better way. Some of the features of that investigation do speak to this issue. Consumer research that we published with the Consumer Council for Water that I think they mentioned in the earlier section show a very low level of satisfaction of South East Water customers with the communications they receive from South East Water.
So you haven't fined any company for not doing what it should do to make sure people are aware of social tariffs they might be entitled to?
We have a first investigation under those two powers right now.
Any company, yeah.
We have not completed any investigations, no. I think we need to do more, and that's what we intend to do.
You've got 480 staff and a £30 million budget, so you've got plenty of resource.
We have the resource and we have the people. We have a number. We are overseeing the delivery of record levels of investment, a £50 billion pipeline of 30 major water projects. We have open enforcement in cases into a number of companies. We have responsibilities around markets and charging, and we are collaborating closely with the departments, DEFRA, and with our fellow regulators as we move towards the establishment of a new integrated water regulator. So we have a lot to do. We have the resources to do that, and the question for us is how we are prioritising within that envelope. Prioritising work on the customer-focused licence condition is something that we will go away and consider.
Just a follow-up question, and slightly, well, in parallel to it. Can you explain to us what an equivalised income is?
I can.
Oh, so you're the other person that understands.
I may be the other person that knows what that is. It is a way of normalising a household income to account for the composition and size of the household. So if you have more than one earner in a house, but no dependents, as opposed to having one earner with lots of dependents, you need to find a way to adjust for that when you consider the question of help for debt and vulnerability, and that's what it is. I think it could be explained more clearly.
You need to use AI to find the dirt.
You might all agree with that point. Can I just Tim Jarvis, just very quickly. You obviously haven't got social tariffs in the same way in your sector, but some companies do actually try and assist with particular arrangements for poorer customers, often with different tariffs, which they do themselves. Is it any part of your job to ask companies which don't use those arrangements to actually look at their competitors and say, well, actually, they can do it, why can't you?
Yes, and we do that, and we work with the body that represents energy retailers to try and encourage best practice. There is quite a lot of support out there from suppliers that off their own back around things like debt matching, for example, and help in the winter with electric blankets and things like that. But it is not a systemised form of support, and I think that we've long argued that there is a case for some targeted support on those households that are particularly struggling with their energy bills and have particularly high consumption, because I think that if you don't target support in that way, then you do end up with a sort of bit of a mismatch of support available.
Thank you very much, Clive. Almost at the end, Tris, please.
Yes, so my question is to mainly Melanie around the use of PSRs in the broadband space. So I do understand the history of broadband is obviously more recent. There's a different statutory history, more complex market structure, weaker tradition of disconnection protections, and broadband has only really become essential in my lifetime in recent years. It didn't exist when I was younger. However, it is now, it is seen as an essential for many people, including those who need broadband to access health services, telecare services. It's seen as essential for those also needing to access their banks and other online provision, which we didn't have 20 years ago. So I suppose my first question is do we need a PSR in the broadband sector, and do you support the DBT proposal to establish a multi-sector share want support register?
Look, I think that could be really helpful. I mean, we don't have one in broadband, and it would be a decision for the government to put one in. But I think, you know, again, if the telecoms companies were here, they would say they'd like more help in working out who is vulnerable so that they can serve them better. And certainly when it comes to the PSTN switch off, what we and the government did was do a lot of work with, in that particular instance, social care and local authorities, because that's where the information is about who's vulnerable to migration of that particular technology, because it's all about care alarms. So I think that's my one slight word of caution, is that for all of our sectors, the relevant question can be a bit specific to the circumstances, and often the data is going to be held at a local level, particularly perhaps in the health system or the care system, and it may or may not be held by the government. So I think there's a question for the government about what information is generic that's useful for everybody. People with long-standing conditions, who under our rules, by the way, are required to be prioritised when there's a fault. Long-term conditions, again, you can have that on a more national register, although it will vary. But there are specific, often quite time-limited circumstances which may need to come from other sources. But can we do more here? Yes, I think it needs the government to kind of work out where it wants to go and for what reasons, and we're very happy to play our part in that.
Because of course, in one suggestion could be when they register with a new provider, if you're saying there's a lot of market fluidity, 1 in 4 people, that is a standard question that could be asked, whether they consider themselves to be a vulnerable customer, and then to provide them details to you. I'm just saying GDPR would make it tricky for information to be shared, perhaps between a private sector provider, public sector to the private sector, given it's a health. Some of these might be health issues in question. So I'm just trying to give maybe a corporate solution to that. But do we know what proportion of customers living with limiting conditions are aware of the additional support available from broadband companies?
No, I don't have that data in front of me. We have other data about how people with long-term conditions feel about their broadband service. As I said, satisfaction is a bit lower than average, but it's still on the high end. But we keep quite a close eye on that. But I don't know that a particular awareness question. If we do have data on that, we're happy to share it.
Okay, and just lastly, obviously, one of the solutions which could cater for everyone is sort of backup connectivity when things go wrong. So perhaps another provider stepping in if one provider goes wrong, which would be a solution for everyone, incidentally, not just vulnerable people. Is that something that the regulator's potentially looking into, where there would be a secondary option for people with backup connectivity?
Yes, this question of what happens when you lose, as you say, what are now essential services, and there's broadband and there's mobile. So a lot of the time, not always, people's broadband might be down, but they'll still have a mobile phone signal, and that will see them through, at least in the short term. But for some, if everything's out, they won't even have that, or they may not have that at their address. So we're doing a number of bits of work. First, as the regulator under the Telecom Security Act, we've done quite a bit on guidance to the industry about what are appropriate backup solutions, such as battery backup. We've not recommended that there should be investment in masts for mobile because it's really expensive. That's a decision I think the government would need to take. But more generally, we've done quite a bit of work, including with Ofgem and the energy industry. And again, the government really ultimately needs to lead this, to work out whether kind of resilience plans are fit for the modern purpose when you have what are increasingly happening, like storms and outages. And do you need to prioritise a bit more the connectivity that we all rely on compared to where you would have been in the past? And I think that's very much a system question, and we will play our part in that as the regulator, and there may be requirements on the industry that flow from that, but it's actually more about, for example, who do the energy companies prioritise for, switching the lights back on? Which are the services that are needed most? That's quite a strategic question for government.
Thank you very much.
Just on that question, is there a sort of parallel here? I mean, if somebody's wearing an emergency push button on their neck and they need their chest and they need to use it, is there a parallel here with the 999 system that they will still get the signal through, almost if everything else fails?
Yes, well, and you're right. 999 is there, and people don't always realise they don't get a mobile phone signal, but actually they should be able to call 999 in an emergency. But could that work for care alarms? The problem is the technology. So a lot of the time, particularly when you're dealing, I'm afraid, with the social care sector, it's very poorly resourced. They are not necessarily using the latest tech. And I'm not sure there is a technical solution that allows you to call 999, have that emergency backup, unless you're using a phone signal. And increasingly it's going to be a digital solution.
Investigate that, because this could be a matter between life and death.
Very happy to take that away immediately, actually, and ask my team to be a bit clearer than perhaps I've been about the technical issues there, because I think there probably are quite a lot of technical issues, but we can give you a proper answer, and if we need to look into it further, we will.
There are no further questions. It's been a long session. The hour is getting late. Can I thank the three of you very much? We've asked inquisitive, intrusive questions because we're so keen to get to the bottom of all of this. So thank you very much indeed. An uncorrected version of the transcript will be out in the next few days, following which we will produce a report with recommendations which we hope you will look at carefully. But again, many thanks for coming to the committee. We've benefited from your advice. Order.